Thank you for joining us today and listening to this audiobook. We truly appreciate your time and support. Before we dive into the story, I'd like to invite you to do something that means the world to us. Please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you're not just staying connected, you're becoming part of an exclusive community dedicated to celebrating knowledge, culture, and empowerment. If you're interested in the ebook or paperback edition of this audiobook, head over to our Amazon page. You'll find the link in the description below. And for those of you looking to show your support in other ways, we've got custom t-shirts, hoodies, and beautiful African wall art available. Just click the merchandise link in the description to check it out. Once again, thank you for being here with us. Your engagement means everything. It helps us continue creating meaningful content and building a space where we can all grow together. So please take a moment now to like, comment, and subscribe. It's more than just a click. It's your way of saying you're with us on this journey. Thank you and enjoy the audiobook.
Dr. Gavin Harrow presents a never-ending Black History series, People, Places, and Things. The Freedmen's Village, Young Readers Edition, Life After Slavery, The Lives of Newly Freed Slaves in Arlington, Virginia, and the Rural South from 1850 to the 1900s. Book 1, Introduction. So, picture this. It's the middle of the Civil War, and right on the land that used to belong to this guy who fought to keep people in chains. Yeah, that's Robert E. Lee. We got something new going on. This place, Freedmen's Village, popped up in 1863, right where Arlington National Cemetery is now. It wasn't just some random shelter for people who'd just been freed from slavery. It was like this big, shaky hope that these folks could start fresh, with dignity and purpose. But, man, for the 3,000 people who ended up calling it home, freedom wasn't some easy road. The past wasn't letting go that easy. Freedmen's Village, it was like this little flicker of hope in a big, dark world. It offered more than just a roof. It was a shot at a real future with housing, education, and medical care. And right there in that history-soaked soil, Arlington's first Black community started to take root. Schools went up, churches were built, and life started to weave together a new story. But let me tell you, getting from slavery to freedom wasn't a walk in the park. Across the South, newly freed folks were hit hard. Starvation, exposure, violence, you name it. Some even got dragged back into the darkness by their old masters, who figured out how to dodge the Union's grip. And others? They were lost, wandering if their families, scattered by war, had made it through. The Freedmen's Bureau, the folks running the village, they were a mixed bag. Sure, they were like a lifeline, but they also held the reins pretty tight. They were there to help, but also to control. This bureau became a symbol of just how tricky freedom was in America, a country still deep in the prejudices it was trying to shake off. The Bureau's rules on work, movement, life, they echoed the chains that were supposed to be broken. Even the groups that tried to help out couldn't escape this vibe of we know best, which ended up stifling as much as it supported. W.E.B. Du Bois, now he saw what others didn't want to see. He knew the freedmen needed more than someone to look after them. They needed rights, justice, real citizenship. To him, the Freedmen's Bureau, despite all its good intentions, was just another plantation, with the same old story of white folks pulling the strings. Sure, the overseers had federal badges now, but the song was still the same. But here's the thing. Even with all that stacked against them, the people of Freedmen's Village found a way to live, to build, to push back. They created a community that wouldn't die, a community that left its mark on Arlington, even after the village was torn down by those who saw it not as a beacon, but as a threat. By 1900, the village was gone, but its spirit lived on in the Black neighborhoods that popped up afterward, places like Green Valley, Hall's Hill, and Johnson's Hill. Today, the legacy of Freedmen's Village isn't in some cold monument or history book. Nope, it's alive in the churches, like Mount Olive and Mount Zion Baptist, where the spirit of the village still breathes in prayers, songs, hands lifted in praise, and voices raised in joy and sorrow. It's in the families, like the Syphax family, who trace their roots back to that sacred ground, holding on to what was and what could have been. These communities that remain, they're the real monuments, the living proof of a struggle that never really ended, The freedom that was promised, the freedom fought for, it's still out there, just out of reach, something to chase, to grab hold of for a moment before it slips away again. But they keep going. These pillars of Black resilience, these community builders, they're the ones keeping the flame alive, pushing the dream forward, step by step, into the 21st century and beyond. About the author. There's a kind of gratitude that bubbles up from deep inside, not just because you survived, but because of the strength it took to keep going. My story, like so many others, is filled with hardship, pain, and faith. A faith that wasn't born out of knowing everything would be okay, but out of needing something to hold on to. I was just 7 years old when my parents abandoned me, leaving me alone in a world that didn't seem to care whether I lived or died. Growing from childhood to manhood wasn't a gradual process for me. It was more like a sudden, brutal leap. By the time I was 12, I was living on the streets, alone, with no one to rely on but myself, and nothing but sheer willpower to keep me going. The streets were my home and my battleground. Every day was a new challenge, a new test of my resolve. It was a time of intense struggle, where every breath I took was a small victory. But through all the adversity, I found a strength inside myself that I didn't even know was there. This strength wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual, the kind of strength that comes from deep within. Today I'm living proof of what perseverance and faith can do. My journey is a reminder that no matter how dark things get, there's always a little spark of hope. It was through God's grace and my own determination that I made it through those tough times. Each day was a challenge, but it shaped me into the person I am today. As I look back on the man I've become, I can't help but give thanks to the woman who's been by my side through it all. My wife, Dr. Nicole Boatswain Harrell. Her unwavering support, her dedication, her brilliance, these things have been my rock. Nicole's work in developmental education is nothing short of amazing. She's a force, a light, and she's shown me what it means to be truly committed to a cause, to a purpose. And to my son, Ethan, you're the reason I push myself to be better every single day. Your spirit, your drive, your energy, they inspire me in ways that are hard to put into words. As I've walked this path, I've found a way to bring together my passions, my experiences, my beliefs. I've dedicated myself to the study of history, earning both a master's and a doctoral degree, focusing on African American studies, law, and government. But for me, academics isn't just about learning facts, it's deeply personal. My academic work is intertwined with my life experiences, and they feed off each other. My time in law enforcement, which began in 2004, is a big part of that. As a police veteran, I've served with distinction, and now I'm a police lieutenant in Washington, D.C. In this role, I manage a large team of police officers and supervisors, which speaks to my leadership and my commitment to keeping the community safe. Before this, I worked as a detective in the Criminal Investigation Division, where I led high-level criminal investigations. That job taught me how to conduct thorough interviews, do meticulous research, and gather evidence with precision. These experiences, both the hardships I've faced and the professional paths I've taken, haven't just shaped who I am. They've shaped how I approach my work as a historian. I bring the same focus, the same attention to detail, and the same relentless drive for truth to my historical research as I do to my law enforcement work. Because at the end of the day, whether I'm uncovering a piece of history or investigating a crime, I'm driven by the same goal. I want to see justice done, I want to bring the truth to light, and I want to make sure that every story, every life is treated with the dignity it deserves. So, yeah, that's my story, one of grit, faith, and a whole lot of determination. And as I keep moving forward, I'll carry those lessons with me, always striving to do right by the past, the present, and the future. Chapter 1. Frederick Douglass and Lincoln, a power duo against slavery. So there's this super important guy named Frederick Douglass who was all about ending slavery. He thought Lincoln was the right guy to lead the country through some pretty messy times, especially when the South decided to break away and start a civil war. Even though Douglass and Lincoln didn't always see eye to eye, Douglass backed Lincoln because he believed this war was a chance to finally get rid of slavery in the U.S. for good. But Douglass wasn't shy about speaking his mind. He really didn't like Lincoln's plan to send African Americans to other countries like Liberia or Haiti. Instead, Douglass wanted free black people and escaped slaves to join the Union Army, even though Lincoln was hesitant at first. As the war went on, Lincoln started to change his mind, partly because he saw firsthand the tough lives of freed slaves. While visiting Washington, D.C., he saw the rough conditions they were living in. Shanties and stinky tents, not great stuff. His visits to a place called the contraband camp made him realize that things needed to change. During this time, Douglass kept pushing Lincoln to think about the needs of black people, especially those who had escaped slavery. Lincoln eventually told Douglass that he valued his opinion more than anyone else's in the country. This shows how powerful Douglass's influence was and how it helped shape the war and the future of the nation. From way back in the 1850s, Lincoln had believed that even those who were enslaved had the same basic rights mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. His ability to understand and connect with people, even those with lives totally different from his own, was a big deal. This understanding played a huge part in the creation of something called Freedmen's Village during the Civil War. It wasn't just a place for freed slaves to live, it was Lincoln's way of making sure they had a place in the new society where they could be free and have rights. Freedmen's Village was more than a refuge, it was a statement. It showed that African Americans had a place in the American experiment of democracy and equality. This place helped shape the post-war world and the ongoing struggle for civil rights. When the Civil War erupted, it reignited anti-slavery feelings in the North, especially after Lincoln became president. He was determined to stop the spread of slavery into new territories, which was a big deal at the time. But he knew he couldn't just end slavery with the snap of his fingers. It took the special powers he got because of the war to start tackling the institution of slavery directly. Then came the Emancipation Proclamation, which Lincoln announced on January 1st, 1863. It wasn't just a speech, it was a game changer. It said that all slaves in the rebellious states were now free. This shifted the war's purpose from just reuniting the country to also ending slavery. Lincoln also hoped that this move would convince countries like Great Britain and France to stop supporting the South. It was a smart move that weakened the Confederacy. But the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't perfect. It freed many slaves, but not all, especially those in the border states that hadn't left the Union. And it wasn't backed by a solid legal foundation, meaning a future president could have reversed it. Even though it didn't end slavery immediately, it was a big step in the right direction, helping to steer the Civil War toward a future where freedom might actually be a reality for everyone. So, picture this. It's November 16, 1861, and Major General John E. Wool gets a note from another general, J.A. Dix. This note wasn't just any note. It was sent because a guy named Jessup showed up at Fort Monroe, Virginia, on a mission. And what was that mission? To get back a slave that had been taken by a regiment. Yeah, it was like old school meets new school, with one world hanging on to the old ways while the winds of change were starting to blow. Now, General Wool, who was in charge, basically said, "Look, I'm not returning any slaves unless the big boss, the Secretary of War, tells me to." He then laid down some rules he called the runaway slaves contrabands and said they were going to be employed, paid, and even given clothes, though not for free. The ones working for the military would get paid about $8 a month, and those working on public works would get 10. After getting their clothes, whatever money was left would be saved to help those who couldn't work. But here's the kicker. If you were able to work, you had to work. No free rides. Meanwhile, in the South, newspapers, politicians, and their supporters kept spreading the idea that this whole Civil War thing was just a big abolitionist plot to take away their slaves. This narrative was designed to scare people and rally them to support the Confederacy. But here's the thing. Union leaders and their buddies up north were like, nope, this isn't just about ending slavery. They were focused on keeping the country together. The Secretary of State even made sure foreign governments got the memo. The Union's main goal wasn't to abolish slavery. Lincoln also played it cool in his inaugural speech, focusing on saving the Union rather than immediately attacking Southern slavery. As Union forces started moving into the South, their commanding generals had to keep things under control. Some even promised to stop any slave revolts with a strong hand. Others, though, did something a bit more questionable. They returned escaped slaves who had sought refuge with the Union troops. This just goes to show how the Union was treading carefully on the whole slavery issue, especially in the early days of the war. The Union was in a real pickle at the start of the Civil War. They were trying to keep the country together, but the whole issue of slavery made things super complicated. It was like trying to balance on a tightrope over a pit of flaming coals. The Union wanted freedom, but they were also tangled up in the mess of slavery, making it tough to figure out what their real goals were at first. It was like they were trying to have their cake and eat it too, wanting freedom, but not fully ready to jump in with both feet. Meanwhile, the South, in a pretty twisted way, found some strength in their weakness. With fewer pro-slavery voices in the North, Southern slaveholders kept their slaves working hard on the plantations. This kept their economy afloat while they sent all their white men to the front lines to fight. The South thought they had it all figured out, but the weight of trying to keep slavery alive while fighting the Union was just too much, even for them. As the war dragged on, enslaved people in the South didn't just sit around waiting for someone to give them freedom. They went out and tried to take it themselves. As Union soldiers moved deeper into the South, many slaves made daring escapes from the plantations, hoping to find protection with the Union forces. But here's the kicker. A lot of Union soldiers, who were supposed to be the good guys, didn't always help. Some even sent the runaway slaves back to the Confederate side, which was just plain cruel. But then, things started to change. The Union government began to realize that they couldn't keep supporting slavery if they wanted to win the war. So, on January 1st, 1863, President Lincoln dropped a bombshell, the Emancipation Proclamation. It didn't free every slave in the country, but it was a huge first step. This wasn't just about saving the Union anymore, it was about fighting for freedom. And with the Union Army enforcing this new order, thousands of slaves escaped to freedom, seeking the protection they'd been denied for so long. So, at first, the Union wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for African Americans to join the fight. They were a bit slow to realize how important these men and women could be on the battlefield. But by early 1864, they had an aha moment. The Union was like, wait a minute, we need all the help we can get. So they reversed their stance, and African American men started joining the ranks in large numbers. And guess what? Their courage and strength started turning the tide. The Union began winning more battles, and this was a big step towards defeating the Confederacy and ending slavery in America. But before things got to that point, it was a real mess. Early on, there was a lot of confusion about what to do with runaway slaves. Some Union commanders welcomed them and put them to work, building forts, or even gave them weapons to fight. But others, stuck in old ways or just plain prejudice, sent them back to the very people they were running from. Can you believe that? It was like trying to decide between chocolate and vanilla, but way more serious and with people's lives at stake. Back in 1861, General Fremont made a bold move by saying, hey, all slaves in Missouri are free now. But not everyone was cheering. There was a big backlash from Democrats and border state politicians, and even President Lincoln, trying to keep everyone happy, had to take it back. Then, 9 months later, General Hunter tried something similar in the South. But once again, the higher-ups pulled the plug. It was like a game of tug-of-war, and freedom kept getting yanked back. But things started changing, even if it was slow. General Butler came up with a clever idea. Instead of calling slaves property, he rebranded them as contraband of war. It was a sneaky legal trick, but it worked. These contrabands were eventually seen as people, and the Union started shifting towards real change. By May 1863, the government even passed a law to pay back slave owners who lost their slaves to the Union forces. It was a way to keep everyone calm and help Union soldiers encourage more enslaved people to seek freedom. The Union Army became a big player in helping slaves escape and join the fight. Public opinion started to swing more and more against slavery too. At the beginning of the war, Congress had passed a resolution saying, hey, we're not going to mess with slavery. But as the war dragged on, that changed. President Lincoln and Congress began offering financial incentives to states that moved towards emancipation. In Washington, D.C., they even abolished slavery, paying millions to former slaveholders. It was a big, complicated shift, but it was moving in the right direction. So, things started heating up when Congress finally put its foot down and made slavery illegal in all U.S. territories. They also passed laws that stopped Army officers from sending escaped slaves back to their old masters. The Union Army even opened its doors to free black men and former slaves from the South, giving them a chance to fight for their freedom. This was a big deal because it showed that the country was inching closer to real freedom for everyone. As the public got more fired up about ending slavery, the government couldn't ignore the pressure. People were writing petitions, holding meetings, and basically shouting from the rooftops that slavery had to go. Lincoln, feeling the heat and following his own moral compass, issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This was a huge moment. It didn't free every slave, but it set the stage for a bigger fight for freedom. But let's be real. The war wasn't exactly a walk in the park. Lincoln warned the rebel states that if they didn't come back to the Union, he'd abolish slavery in their territories. When they ignored him, he made good on his promise on January 1st, 1863. This sent shockwaves everywhere, even making countries like Great Britain think twice about supporting the Confederacy. African American soldiers were pumped, fighting not just for the Union, but for their own freedom. However, the proclamation had its limits. It only applied to areas under Union control, but that was enough to shake things up in the South. Slaves started running to Union lines, which messed with the Southern economy and caused even more chaos. The war dragged on until 1865 when the Confederacy finally collapsed, and the freedom Lincoln promised started to take hold. But real freedom, that took a bit longer. It wasn't until President Johnson's Reconstruction that the South accepted emancipation as the new reality, sealed by the 13th Amendment. The Emancipation Proclamation was a turning point. The Union wasn't just fighting to stay together anymore. They were fighting to end slavery. This gave the soldiers a renewed sense of purpose, especially African American soldiers who knew their fight would lead to their own liberation. While the proclamation didn't free every slave right away, it was a crucial first step toward true freedom for all Americans. On December 18, 1865, the Secretary of State announced that enough states had agreed to amend the Constitution to ban slavery for good. But here's the kicker. While the legal chains of slavery were broken, real equality was still a long way off. Freedmen were legally free, but they were still treated like second-class citizens. They knew they deserved better, but the path to true equality was unclear and full of challenges. In the North, some folks thought the best solution was for freedmen to leave the U.S. and start over somewhere else. The government even offered to pay for it. But the freedmen weren't having it. They fought too hard for their freedom and demanded the same rights as everyone else. It took years of struggle, but eventually, they won full citizenship and equal rights under the law. Their fight became a key part of American history. The debate over what to do with the freedmen was far from over. Some people had all kinds of ideas, resettling them in Africa or Mexico, setting aside certain states just for them, or even keeping them in a weird, half-free state. But none of these ideas really took off. The fear was that the U.S., after freeing the slaves, wouldn't go the extra mile to ensure complete equality before the law. Without that, the freedmen would be stuck in a tough spot, possibly even worse off than before, left vulnerable to the whims of their former masters. So, after the Civil War, the South wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat for freedmen. Nope. They were more like, how can we keep things just the way they were? They passed all sorts of laws to make sure that freedmen didn't get too comfortable with this whole freedom thing. They actually thought that if they didn't pass special laws, the freedmen would just become criminals or end up poor, which is crazy, right? These laws made sure that freedmen couldn't be full citizens like everyone else. Some folks even talked about branding them like cattle so they could be easily tracked down if they tried to escape their new jobs. Basically, the South wanted to keep freedmen in a kind of economic prison. They might not have been slaves anymore, but they were forced to work under some pretty harsh conditions, with barely any rights and zero protection. The old Southern laws were filled with hatred, like they just couldn't let go of the past, and they definitely weren't about to let freedmen live on equal footing with white folks. Down there, if you were a freedman, forget about serving on a jury or even testifying in court. It was like your voice didn't matter. And get this, they weren't even allowed to carry firearms, which meant they couldn't defend themselves. It's like they were stuck in a no-win situation, just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Freedmen were also hit with all sorts of restrictions. They couldn't gather in groups of more than 5 without a written pass from a white magistrate. That's right, they even tried to stop them from meeting up to pray. Some of them needed special licenses just to work for themselves, and any white person could force them into labor whenever they wanted. Talk about a raw deal. On top of that, they were taxed more than whites, and there were all sorts of laws designed to keep them in economic chains. The goal? Keep freedmen working for white folks, with almost no rights to speak of. Vagrancy laws were a big part of this mess. If a freedman wasn't working for a white employer, they could be arrested, fined, or even forced to work off their debt, which is pretty much just slavery with extra steps. Labor contracts became another way to keep freedmen under control. These contracts had to be in writing, and if a freedman tried to leave before it was up, they could be thrown in jail and sent back to their employer, just like in the old days. But if the employer broke the deal, good luck getting justice in a court run by white judges and juries. The whole system was rigged to keep freedmen down, making true freedom feel like a distant dream. So you'd think being free would be all sunshine and rainbows for the freedmen, but nope, not even close. Employers had this sneaky trick where they could deduct the cost of food, clothing, and medical care from the freedmen's wages, leaving them with practically nothing. It was like a bad magic trick. Poof, there goes your money. They said it was to protect both sides, but really it was just another way to keep the freedmen under control, making sure they stayed stuck in the same old cycle of economic slavery. In South Carolina, if a freedman wanted to do anything other than farm work or be a servant, they had to get a special license. And guess what? That license cost a ton, anywhere from $10 to $100 a year. Talk about a ripoff. The so-called colorblind laws were just another way to keep the freedmen down, forcing them into labor, especially their kids. A local judge could just decide that a black child under 18 had to work, and that was that. All these rights and privileges they were supposed to have, they were basically a joke. The whip was still being used, and it was like a bad memory that wouldn't go away. Freedmen were constantly reminded that their old masters still looked down on them, no matter what. But here's the thing. Despite everything stacked against them, the freedmen didn't give up. They worked harder than ever, rebuilding their lives, their homes, and their churches. Northern philanthropists helped out by starting schools for their kids, and the freedmen didn't just stop there. They got involved in politics too, demanding the rights they deserved as citizens. Progress was slow, but it was happening. Of course, they faced a ton of challenges, not just legally, but socially and economically too. Trying to get an education? That was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. White folks saw it as a threat, and their response was brutal. Churches and schools were burned down by angry mobs. In places where there wasn't much government oversight, former slaveholders kept treating African Americans terribly, with no fear of getting in trouble. Life after emancipation wasn't a walk in the park. The newly freed people were thrown into a world full of hostility, poverty, and a lack of basic skills like reading and writing. They were stuck in low-paying jobs, with little chance to save up or get ahead. And to make things worse, violence was everywhere. In just 1 month, there were 49 cases of white-on-black violence, and the authorities didn't do much to stop it. Many in the South still believed slavery was a blessing and that emancipation was a disaster. Even though they had to accept that slavery was over, they held on to their old beliefs. This created a toxic environment where the newly freed were not only unwelcome, but were actively targeted. All right, imagine this. You're finally free after years of being a slave, but the world isn't exactly rolling out the red carpet. You've got to find a job and a place to live. Easier said than done. Some folks went back to the very plantations where they were once enslaved, while others headed to the cities to try their luck. But no matter where they went, things were tough. Employers ripped them off, making them work long hours for hardly any pay. Independence was a heavy load after a lifetime of being told what to do, and many found themselves homeless and struggling. Next up was education. Getting an education was like climbing a mountain with no gear. Schools for African Americans were few and far between, and the ones that existed were pretty lousy. To make matters worse, a lot of white folks didn't want black people getting educated and did everything they could to stop it. But the freedmen didn't back down. Some managed to get educated and used it to improve their lives and help others. Then came the fight for political rights. This was a real uphill battle. Most states had laws that kept African Americans from voting, and groups like the Ku Klux Klan used violence and fear to keep the freedmen from speaking up. But even with all this against them, some freedmen found ways to get involved in politics and started pushing for change. The journey was long and filled with obstacles, but the freedmen made progress. They gained ground in education, work, and political rights. It wasn't easy, but their determination started carving out a better future, one step at a time. Meanwhile, Southern politicians and the press were holding on to the idea that they were overpowered but not subdued. It was like they were saying, "We might have lost, but we're not giving up." They twisted the meaning of freedom until it looked like slavery all over again. The South became a hotbed of violence and injustice, with black people bearing the brunt of the cruelty. Riots erupted in places like Memphis and New Orleans, sending shockwaves through the country. Even some folks in the South couldn't stand the brutality and spoke out against it. The cry for justice grew louder, sparking hope that maybe things would finally change. After the Civil War, the freedmen found themselves in a society that wasn't ready to give them full civil or political rights. They were free, but only on paper. With few allies in the South, they were trapped in a cycle of poverty and discrimination. But they didn't just sit back and accept it. When the chance came, they fought to improve their situation. The push for freedom and equality was driven by both private citizens and the government. Non-governmental organizations and individuals played a big role in advocating for the freedmen's rights, often pushing the government to take action. In a democracy, it's the people who lead and the government that follows. Throughout the struggle, the freedmen and their allies, both black and white, demanded more than the government was initially willing to give. They called for freedom, for the creation of the Freedmen's Bureau, for civil rights, and for the right to vote, all before these things were officially recognized. Public opinion was powerful, forcing the government to act. This was also true for private religious and charitable organizations that championed the freedmen's cause. These groups often moved faster and did more than the official government agencies. The efforts of these grassroots activists were crucial, laying the groundwork for the progress that would eventually come. These private agencies and individuals played an essential role in making emancipation more than just a word on paper. They worked tirelessly to ensure that freedom was a blessing, even when few others cared. They put in their time, labor, and resources when even the government was reluctant to make sacrifices. They went into the hostile South armed with the gospel and practical tools to empower the freedmen facing widespread hostility with courage and determination. Their work laid the foundation for the progress that would eventually come, showing just how important grassroots activism is in the fight for justice and equality. The Civil War was a time of massive upheaval, but it also sparked efforts to help and educate those who had been freed from slavery. Even before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, there were attempts to free slaves in Union-held territories. Generals Fremont and Hunter issued orders to free the enslaved in their areas, but these bold moves were later rolled back as the nation's policy on slavery was still in flux. In the middle of all this uncertainty, General T.W.M. Sherman and Commodore DuPont captured forts at Port Royal and took control of the Sea Islands. There, they found masses of uneducated, starving black people, newly freed but completely unprepared for freedom. It was a scene of chaos, a reminder that freedom without the means to sustain it was an empty victory. Horace S. Payne Chase, then Secretary of the Treasury, saw an opportunity amidst this tragedy. When he heard about the unpicked cotton left on the islands, he sent an Army officer to gather it. But when the officer returned, he reported that the situation was far more complicated. The task wasn't just about collecting cotton, it was about addressing the urgent needs of the freedmen, needs that went beyond survival to include education, welfare, and farming the land they now occupied. Congress, focused on the war, had made no plans for these newly freed people. They were liberated but left to fend for themselves, their future uncertain. And so the fight for their freedom continued, not on the battlefield, but in the fields of the Sea Islands, where the struggle to build a new life had just begun. Chapter 2. The Freedmen's Bureau, a beacon of hope. So, picture this. The Civil War ends, and suddenly, millions of people who were once enslaved are now free. But free doesn't mean easy street. These folks needed more than just freedom. They needed food, shelter, and someone to stand up for them. That's where the Freedmen's Bureau comes in, a kind of superhero team for the newly freed. At first, the Treasury Department tried to help, but pretty quickly, the War Department took over because, let's face it, they had the muscle and the resources to really make a difference. They knew these freed people needed more than just freedom. They needed a government willing to fight for their rights. So, the idea for the Freedmen's Bureau was born. This wasn't just a handout, but a real attempt to help these folks stand on their own 2 feet. The Bureau wasn't just for freed slaves, but also for poor white people who were loyal to the Union and needed help too. After some pushback, because, of course, there were people who didn't want to see real change, the Bureau was officially created. President Lincoln signed off on it, and a bunch of assistant commissioners were sent to the South to help where the battle for equality was still very real. But here's the thing. Being free didn't mean life was easy. The South was a mess, with its old ways of doing things turned upside down. The whole labor system that kept the South running was gone, and nobody was sure what was supposed to happen next. The freed people were hopeful but also a little lost. Some dreamed of farming their own land, while others wondered if they'd just end up working the same hard jobs they always had. Even basic rights, like the ability to testify in court or get an education, were still up in the air. General Oliver Otis Howard was the guy in charge of the Freedmen's Bureau. His job? To make sure these freed folks had what they needed to survive and thrive. The Bureau handed out food and clothes, managed abandoned lands, and helped with everything from labor contracts to legal rights. They even worked on getting schools set up because they knew education was key to real freedom. But not everyone was on board. Some people up north were suspicious that Southern whites were trying to keep things just like they were before, only with a new name. The folks who had fought to free the slaves weren't about to let that happen without a fight. They wanted to make sure that the war had really changed things, not just on paper, but in real life. The Freedmen's Bureau was a lifeline. It helped people get on their feet, find work, and get an education. But by the 1870s, people up north started to lose interest in Reconstruction. Congress in the northern states had other things on their minds, and support for the freedmen began to fade. The Bureau didn't last long, but in the short time it was around, it made a big difference. The Freedmen's Bureau was a beacon of hope during a time of huge change. It showed what could be done when the government stepped up to help those in need. Even though its time was short, its impact was lasting, a reminder of both the possibilities and the limits of freedom in a divided country. So, picture this. It's March 1865, the Civil War is wrapping up, and Congress passes a super important bill. Enter General Oliver Otis Howard, the new head honcho of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, originally, this bureau was supposed to be a quick fix, just help out for a year after the war, and then call it a day. But as everyone quickly realized, this job was way too big to slap a 1-year expiration date on it. So, they extended the Bureau's mission because, freedom doesn't just happen overnight. General Oliver Howard, who was known as the Christian General because of his strong faith, took over at a time when everything was pretty chaotic. Before the Bureau got its act together, help for the freedmen was coming from all over the place. Department commanders, treasury agents, you name it. But the problem was, none of these efforts were really connected. It was like a bunch of people trying to bake a cake without talking to each other. One person's mixing, another's adding sugar, and someone else is just throwing eggs on the floor. The result? A big mess and not much cake. People who had been freed from slavery were herded into camps and barracks, but there wasn't much to do there, so they just ended up suffering from boredom and neglect. Even the good intentions, like building schools, went nowhere because there wasn't a plan or a leader to guide them. That's where the Freedmen's Bureau came in, to get everything organized and make sure the work being done was actually helping people. The Bureau's mission was huge: provide education, medical care, and job training for the freedmen, help them find housing and work, and make sure they were treated fairly in a world that had been anything but fair. In a lot of ways, the Bureau did an awesome job, giving many former slaves the support they needed to start fresh. On May 19, 1865, General Howard made his first big move, laying out how the Bureau was going to tackle this enormous job. With his background as a West Point Military Academy graduate and his deep moral convictions, Howard wasn't messing around. He quickly appointed his assistant commissioners and got to work. His leadership was a game changer, helping to steer the Freedmen's Bureau in a direction that would make a real difference in the lives of those who had just gained their freedom. So, even though General Howard was all about doing the right thing and making a difference, he wasn't exactly welcomed with open arms. The Freedmen's Bureau, under his leadership, hit a ton of roadblocks. First off, there wasn't nearly enough money coming from the government to keep things running smoothly. On top of that, folks in the South were seriously not on board with any plan that tried to lift up the freedmen. And let's not forget the North, where plenty of people doubted that black folks could really turn things around. But even with all these challenges, Howard didn't back down. He had this unwavering vision of justice, and he was determined to see it through, no matter what. The Freedmen's Bureau, teaming up with different volunteer organizations, actually made some pretty huge progress. They reorganized labor, made sure justice was being served more fairly, and got serious about education. Thanks to their efforts, the transition from slavery to freedom wasn't just some pipe dream, it was happening. Black Americans were stepping out of the shadows, getting closer to what it meant to be full citizens of the United States. But let's be real. Howard's work didn't exactly make him the most popular guy in the South. Many white Southerners saw the Bureau as a big, flashing neon sign that the old social order was crumbling. And leading the charge against him was none other than President Andrew Johnson, who was one of the Bureau's biggest critics. Johnson went after Howard hard, accusing him of fraud and stealing the Bureau's funds. Things got intense on May 5, 1874, when these accusations led to a full-blown investigation. But here's the twist. When the special court dug into these charges, they found out they were all smoke and no fire. Howard was cleared of all wrongdoing. proving that the attacks against him were just another way for opponents to try and shut down the Bureau's mission. This whole saga shone a spotlight on the uphill battle the Freedmen's Bureau faced as it worked to support and empower newly freed Black Americans during the tumultuous Reconstruction era. Now, let's break down what the War Department and the Freedmen's Bureau actually did to improve the lives of the freedmen. Their efforts can be grouped into 4 key areas. Providing for basic needs. The Bureau has stepped in to make sure the freedmen had food, clothing, and shelter, essentials that were critical as they transitioned to freedom. Promoting justice. They worked hard to ensure that Black Americans had access to justice in a legal system that had long been stacked against them. This was about more than just legal rights. It was about fairness and protection. Reorganizing labor. The Bureau helped restructure the labor system, moving away from the oppressive practices of slavery towards something that could potentially be fair and sustainable. Access to education. Recognizing that education was key to empowerment, the Bureau made it a priority to establish schools and enforce the right to learn. This was a massive step forward, opening doors that had long been closed to Black Americans. So, while the journey was tough and the obstacles many, the Freedmen's Bureau, under General Howard's leadership, laid the groundwork for a better, more just future. Special relief for the freedmen. The transition from slavery to freedom was anything but smooth. It was a time of incredible hardship for the newly liberated African Americans who faced extreme challenges just to survive. Many suffered terribly. Exposed to the elements without proper shelter, some died from the harsh weather while others succumbed to starvation. On top of these struggles, white mobs terrorized the freedmen, adding violence to the already overwhelming difficulties. This brutal environment led to a significant decline in the African American population in the South, a tragic outcome of the chaos left in the wake of the Civil War. The old system of forced labor in the South had collapsed, leaving the region in shambles. The Confederate currency was worthless, the crops had been destroyed by the war, and there were few tools or resources left to rebuild. The situation was made even worse by widespread droughts that hit many southern states after the war, plunging those trying to rebuild their lives into deeper crisis. During the war, many able-bodied freedmen found themselves herded into camps, barracks, or makeshift colonies. Some joined the Union Army, but others were forcibly taken by their former masters further into the South, away from their families, making it nearly impossible for them to reunite, even if they were brave enough to try. These men, women, and children were left completely dependent on public aid to survive. Shockingly, even after the war ended and the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, some freedmen were still held in bondage. Determined to evade Union forces, some masters kidnapped their former slaves and fled deeper into the rural South, continuing to exploit their labor. With many men off fighting in the war, the women and children were left alone to scrape by as best they could. They would gather whatever they could find and go door to door or from camp to camp, begging for food. Their existence was miserable, surviving on roots, berries, and any scraps they could scavenge from fields and woods. Seeing how desperate the situation was, the Freedmen's Bureau made it their top priority to provide immediate relief to these destitute people. The Bureau tackled this overwhelming challenge in 2 main ways. First, they established colonies on abandoned farms, where the freedmen were given plots of land to farm. The government supplied them with seeds, tools, and other essential resources to get started. They were also provided with food and clothing until their crops could be harvested. In some cases, the government even provided livestock to help them rebuild their lives and sustain their newfound independence. Second, the Bureau constructed camps and barracks to provide temporary shelter for those who had nowhere else to go. These makeshift homes were a stopgap measure, giving the freedmen a place to stay until more permanent housing could be found. The Bureau's efforts were crucial in helping these newly freed individuals survive the immediate aftermath of the war and start building a new life for themselves. Through these initiatives, the Freedmen's Bureau offered a lifeline to those who had endured unimaginable hardships, helping them take their first steps toward a future where they could live freely and with dignity. The Freedmen's Villages were meant to be a lifeline, a place where newly freed African Americans could find stability and learn to support themselves after the devastation of the Civil War. These colonies were designed to be self-sufficient, with the hope that the residents would eventually no longer need government assistance. But this vision met with harsh realities. The resources needed to support the freedmen simply weren't there. The South, ravaged by war, had neither the money nor the willingness to care for this newly freed population. even if it had wanted to. Many Southerners believed that since the North had freed the enslaved, it was also the North's responsibility to take care of them afterward. This was not an entirely unreasonable belief, but it created a serious problem when Congress failed to allocate specific funds for the freedmen's care. Without this support, both the freedmen and the Bureau, tasked with helping them, were left to struggle with inadequate resources. The lack of funding made an already difficult situation even more challenging, as the Bureau tried to address the enormous needs of the freedmen with limited supplies. General Charles Henry Howard, the younger brother of General Oliver Otis Howard, was a key figure in this effort. Like his brother, Charles Howard was a West Point graduate who had served with distinction during the Civil War. He commanded the 128th United States Colored Troops, USCT, leading African American soldiers in their fight for freedom and the Union. After the war, he took on a vital role in the Freedmen's Bureau, overseeing the activities of Freedmen's Village. As the leader of the village, General Charles Howard was responsible for ensuring that residents had the essentials: clothing, food, and fuel. He issued orders that allowed him to requisition any surplus or unusable supplies from the troops. In cases of urgent need, he could request emergency rations from the commissary department. However, despite these provisions, he had to carefully manage the limited resources, making sure that they were used wisely and only when absolutely necessary. One of General Charles Howard's biggest concerns was avoiding the creation of a culture of idleness and dependence among the freedmen, a fear widely shared by the public. He knew that these villages and camps were meant to be temporary solutions, not permanent ones. In his orders, he made it clear that the relief operations should be shut down as quickly as possible once the war ended and people were able to return to work. The goal was to help only those who were truly needy and destitute, ensuring that the freedmen could eventually stand on their own. The freedmen's villages, under General Howard's guidance, aimed to provide a temporary refuge, a place where the newly freed could regain their strength and learn to live independently. But the challenges were immense, and the path to self-sufficiency was anything but smooth. Despite the best efforts of those involved, the lack of resources and the overwhelming needs of the freedmen made this transition incredibly difficult. Yet, through it all, the dedication of leaders like General Charles Howard shone through, as they worked tirelessly to help the freedmen build new lives in the aftermath of slavery. The Freedmen's Bureau, under the leadership of General Charles Howard, was pivotal in helping the newly freed population rebuild their lives after the Civil War. One of the Bureau's key successes was reuniting families that had been torn apart during the conflict. It also found employment for able-bodied men and women, placing them in homes where they could start anew. The overarching goal was always to help the freedmen become self-sufficient as quickly as possible. To achieve this, the Bureau constructed rows of dark barracks near each site to provide temporary shelter for the liberated slaves. However, these makeshift colonies were disbanded as soon as it was feasible. Freedmen were encouraged to enter into labor contracts with neighboring plantations, promoting their independence. Farms were also cultivated to help offset the costs associated with maintaining the colonies. Medical care was another critical area addressed by the Bureau. Hospitals were established at various locations to treat the ill and injured among the freedmen. The disruption of family structures during the war led to many children being born into orphanage or left without parental care. These orphans received support from Northern voluntary organizations dedicated to their welfare. Despite the Bureau's efforts, its operation was seen as an experiment, and opinions on its effectiveness were deeply divided. Some believed it provided vital support to those in need, while others felt the government's involvement was misguided. Nevertheless, the Bureau's intervention saved countless lives and played a crucial role in the reconstruction effort, helping the freedmen transition to their new lives and providing the support necessary for them to survive and thrive in the post-war South. Chapter 3. Building Freedmen's Village, the Blueprint of Freedom. The image below gives us a glimpse into Freedmen's Village, a community born out of the chaos of the Civil War. This village, built on the estate of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, was more than just a camp for emancipated slaves. It was a place of hope, where those freed from bondage could begin to rebuild their lives. Located just half a mile from Arlington House, now known as Arlington National Cemetery, Freedmen's Village was initially conceived as a temporary refuge. Here, newly freed people could gain the skills and confidence needed to stand on their own. As time went on, many of the residents chose to stay, finding in this community a sense of belonging they had long been denied. What started as a transitional camp slowly grew into a thriving community, home to several thousand freedmen who drew strength and solace from each other. In 1863, Lieutenant Colonel Elias M. Green took a decisive step by establishing a camp at Arlington specifically for self-emancipated slaves who had fled during the war. This camp would become part of the larger Freedmen's Village, where the promise of freedom, hard-won and fragile, began to take root. Everyone who arrived at Freedmen's Village was met with care and dignity. They were given clothing, rations, and the best accommodations the camp could offer. Men and women found work on site, contributing to various businesses or laboring on government farms, while children attended school, perhaps for the first time in their lives. Those too old or too sick to work were not forgotten. They were provided with housing at the camp hospital, a place where they could find some comfort in their final days. Freedmen's Village was just one of many communities the Freedmen's Bureau established across the South, each serving as a sanctuary for those who had been newly emancipated. These communities were more than just places to live. They were lifelines, offering freedmen a chance to transition from the horrors of slavery to the uncertain promise of freedom. The Bureau, tasked with operating these villages, provided essentials like food, clothing, and employment opportunities, ensuring that the residents had what they needed to survive and begin rebuilding their lives. But survival was not the only goal. The village offered something more profound: access to education and medical care, tools necessary not just to live, but to thrive. In a world that had long denied them even the most basic rights, these provisions were more than necessities. They were the first steps toward a new life, toward the freedom that had been so long in coming. On August 15, 1864, General Montgomery C. Meigs, ever vigilant in his duties, called for a special inspection of Freedmen's Village and the government farms within its confines. The task fell to Major E. H. Ludington, who, after his inspection, provided a detailed report on the operation and conditions of the village. This inspection was more than a mere formality. It reflected the ongoing concern for the welfare of the freedmen who had sought refuge on the Arlington estate. Freedmen's Village was established during the summer of 1863, born out of necessity as countless destitute freedmen streamed into Washington, seeking safety and a fresh start. The Arlington estate became their sanctuary, a place where the promise of freedom could begin to take root. The organization and management of this village were entrusted to Lieutenant Green, the chief quartermaster of the department, who was tasked with the formidable responsibility of overseeing its operations. To ensure the village's sustenance, a controversial provision was put in place. A deduction of $5 per month was taken from the pay of each freedman employed by the Union Army or any government department. This deduction, while intended to support the community, highlighted the complex and often harsh realities faced by the freedmen as they navigated their newfound freedom within a system still grappling with remnants of the old order. The inspection and subsequent report underscored both the challenges and the resilience of those striving to build a life in the aftermath of slavery. From the Freedmen's Fund that steadily accrued, a village took shape, a refuge that provided adequate homes for some 2,000 people, each structure a testament to the resilience of those who now inhabited them. The village was more than just a collection of homes. It was a community built with care. A reservoir ensured an ample water supply which flowed through pipes laid across every street. Stoves and cooking utensils were distributed to each family, ensuring the basic needs of warmth and nourishment were met. A home for the infirm was established, offering care for those too old or sick to fend for themselves. Education also found its place within the village, as the American Tract Society opened a school for both children and adults. The American Tract Society, originally focused on spreading Christian literature, found a new mission after emancipation. They realized that true freedom required more than just the breaking of physical chains. It also needed the enlightenment of the mind. The society took on the education of the formerly enslaved, distributing essential learning tools like the Freedmen's Reader and Speller through various Sabbath schools. These simple yet powerful books encouraged more people to attend church services and Sabbath schools, uniting the community in a shared thirst for knowledge and spiritual growth. In Freedmen's Village, built from the Freedmen's Fund, these efforts sowed the seeds of a new life, one where education, faith, and community offered the first steps toward a future once thought impossible. The War Department, determined to use the freedmen's own funds for their benefit, spared no expense in making the village a place of refuge and renewal. Despite significant expenditures, the Freedmen's Fund continued to grow, reflecting both careful management and the resilience of the community it served. Items that couldn't be provided by the quartermaster's department were purchased directly from the Freedmen's Fund, ensuring that no need went unmet. Rations were consistently provided by the subsistence department, while medicine and medical care came from the medical department, ensuring that the physical health of the freedmen was cared for with the same diligence as their basic needs. There was an underlying belief that the great demand for labor across the country would soon secure employment for the freedmen, making the village a temporary stop on their journey from slavery to freedom, a brief way station before they fully stepped into their new lives. Lieutenant Green, understanding the need for both work and sustenance, authorized the freedmen to cultivate the abandoned farms of Confederate owners. It was believed that with the abundant supply of freedmen's labor, even at minimal wages, these lands would yield profitable returns. Thus, 5 farms, encompassing 1,270 acres, were fenced and cultivated during the 1863 season, with full cultivation achieved by 1864. Through this labor, the freedmen began to reclaim not just the land, but a sense of purpose and autonomy, transforming fields of war-torn despair into fertile ground for their own futures. Condition of the village. At the time of the initial inspection, Freedmen's Village housed 411 men, 658 women, and 1,097 children, a total of 2,166 individuals seeking refuge in a new beginning. The report painted a picture of a community that, despite the hardships of its members' past, was finding its footing. Residents were housed comfortably, with just enough clothing to meet their needs, plenty of food to sustain them, and a general appearance of health that spoke to the care they were receiving. The village itself was well situated and maintained with a keen eye for cleanliness. A schoolhouse built by the American Tract Society became the center of education within the village. The society not only provided the building but also supplied the teachers and oversaw the school's operations. 400 children attended, and the progress they made was evident, a source of pride for the community. The school's excellence was noted with pleasure, a beacon of hope in a landscape scarred by the ravages of war and slavery. At the House for the Infirm, several decrepit and disabled individuals were cared for with comfort and dignity, ensuring that even the most vulnerable among the freedmen were not forgotten. The residents of the village took pride in keeping themselves and their homes clean, reflecting the self-respect they were reclaiming in this new chapter of their lives. Within the village, a tailor shop was established where several women were employed in the manufacture of clothing. These women were paid fair wages, and the clothing they produced was sold at cost, allowing the freedmen to benefit directly from their labor. This practice echoed the earlier provision that mandated a $5 deduction from the pay of freedmen employed by the government, a policy that had helped to establish the village in the first place. In this way, the village became a place where the freedmen's labor not only sustained them, but also laid the groundwork for their community's continued growth and success. Necessary clothing was provided to dependent freedmen, those in the village, who were unable to work or sustain themselves. For those who were employed, a portion of their pay was withheld each month to cover the needs of the dependent members of the community. This system ensured that even the most vulnerable among them were cared for. Children were allotted half of a ration each day, while adults received a full ration, though these rations were distributed only once per day, reflecting the need to carefully manage resources. The entire operation of the village was overseen by the government, which took on the responsibility of procuring rations, arranging transportation, covering hospital expenses, and paying the officers and guards who maintained order. The costs associated with clothing, building expenses, and necessary repairs throughout the village were all drawn from the Freedmen's Fund. This fund, built from the labor of the freedmen themselves, was also used to pay the salaries of white employees who worked within the village. This system, while ensuring the village's operation, highlighted the complex dynamics of dependency and self-sufficiency that shaped the lives of the freedmen as they navigated their new reality in a world still marked by deep inequalities. Mason's Island. The village soon proved insufficient to accommodate the rapidly growing number of freedmen, leading to the assignment of Mason's Island Barracks to Lieutenant Green to handle the overflow. The island became home to 149 men, 418 women, and 615 children, totaling 1,182 individuals. However, when Major E.H. Ludington made his initial visit to Mason's Island, he was struck by the disorder that pervaded the place. The people were crammed into the barracks with little regard for organization or classification, despite the prevailing idea that only those who stayed on the island were meant to be candidates for service in the Union Army. The infirm, the disabled, the sick, and the children were all present in significant numbers, creating a chaotic and unhealthy environment. Men and women, with no separation of the sexes, were housed together in the overcrowded barracks of Mason's Island, sleeping on the floor without any distinction. The freedmen voiced their concerns primarily about the lack of clothing and the fact that they were not being paid for their labor. Major Ludington, who inspected the island, observed that much of their time was spent in idleness, a stark contrast to the more structured environment of Freedmen's Village. Their barracks were overcrowded, and there was an urgent need for a hospital to address the growing medical concerns. Adding to their frustrations, Lieutenant Green refused to provide transportation for the freedmen to visit their friends and loved ones in the village or other areas, deepening their sense of isolation and abandonment. Yet, amidst this bleak situation, there was a glimmer of hope. After Ludington's visit, the Friends Society of Philadelphia began planning to establish a school on the island, with teachers already present, ready to educate the freedmen. This initiative offered a much-needed beacon of hope in a place overshadowed by neglect and disorder, a first step toward bringing some semblance of dignity and opportunity to the freedmen on Mason's Island. Farms. At the time of the inspection, 5 government farms, encompassing 1,270 acres, were under cultivation in the vicinity of Arlington and the village. These farms were carved out of land that had once belonged to Confederate owners, land that had been abandoned and left to decay. The soil was poor, the fields choked with brush, and the absence of fencing left the land vulnerable and wild. It required considerable effort and expense to clear the brush, fence the fields, and make the land suitable for farming once again. The proceeds from the sale of all crops produced on these farms were turned over to the Quartermaster's Department, reinforcing the government's control over the economic output of these lands. To support the farming operations, the Quartermaster's Department constructed 2 buildings, one for the residence of the superintendent and the other a barn to store the tools and harvest necessary for the work ahead. The employees, with resourcefulness born of necessity, built themselves adequate log huts at minimal expense, creating modest homes close to the fields where they labored. With the exception of the superintendent, most of the farm employees were freedmen. These men, who had only recently emerged from the bonds of slavery, now worked the land for wages that ranged from $2 to $10 per month, along with 1 ration per day. Though the pay was meager and the work hard, it represented a step toward autonomy, a chance to earn a living, however modest, and to take part in the rebuilding of a world that had once sought to deny them any stake in its future. The transformation of these neglected fields into productive farms was a testament to their resilience, a small but significant victory in the ongoing struggle for freedom and dignity. On January 9, 1864, Colonel Greene informed General Meigs that the American Tract Society, with characteristic generosity, had erected a schoolhouse and chapel at Freedmen's Village on the Arlington estate, as well as a home for the aged and infirm, all without charge. The school was not merely a place of basic education. It was designed to complement the workshops within the village. Only the most promising and intelligent boys were selected for employment in these workshops, where they could learn the trades of carpentry, blacksmithing, wheelwrighting, harness making, and other mechanical occupations. These skills offered them a path not just to survival, but to a future where they could build lives of independence and self-sufficiency. Women and girls, under the guidance of competent instructors, found profitable employment in the manufacture of clothing. As they worked, they also learned the use of the needle and the sewing machine, skills that would serve them well in both earning a living and caring for their families. This combination of work and education was a deliberate effort to equip the freedmen with the practical skills they needed to thrive in a world that was still hostile to their progress. For those who were sick, there was a hospital providing the care they required. The aged and infirm found shelter and comfort in the home that had been built for them, ensuring that even the most vulnerable members of the community were not left behind. Many of the freedmen initially lived in Sibley tents, intended as temporary shelters until more permanent quarters could be erected. Though these tents were meant to be a stopgap, they symbolized the uncertainty of this transitional period, a time of great hope, tempered by the reality that the journey from slavery to freedom was fraught with challenges. Yet, even in these makeshift homes, the seeds of a new life were being planted, nurtured by the efforts of those who believed in the potential of these newly freed people to rise above their past. The broadside, a printed announcement detailing the government regulations for Freedmen's Village at Green Heights on the Arlington House plantation grounds, provided a glimpse into the structured system designed to manage the lives of the newly freed. The superintendent of freedmen was tasked with overseeing the village and the broader interests of the contrabands, newly freed slaves, across various government farms, all under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel Elias M. Green, the chief quartermaster of the Department of Washington. Upon arrival at the camp, ex-slaves underwent a process of cleansing and were provided with serviceable clothing. These initial steps were vital in restoring a sense of dignity after the long and arduous journey to freedom. Their immediate needs were met with food rations and available quarters, ensuring a semblance of stability in their new lives. The superintendent of freedmen then undertook the responsibility of identifying the most promising young adults, assigning them to work in the workshops established within the village. These workshops offered a rare chance for skill development in trades such as carpentry, blacksmithing, and other crafts, skills that were essential in their pursuit of independence and self-sufficiency. Able-bodied men and women who had once been forced to labor under the yoke of slavery were now sent to work on government farms, though still under the supervision of another superintendent. This work, while demanding, was seen as a necessary step in the transition from slavery to self-sufficiency, framing labor as a path to autonomy rather than oppression. Children were sent to school where they could finally receive the education that had long been denied to them. Meanwhile, those who were sick were cared for in hospitals and nursing homes, ensuring that every individual, regardless of age or condition, was given a place and purpose within the village. The system aimed to provide for the basic needs of all, while also fostering a sense of order and purpose in the lives of the freedmen. However, the provision of clothing for those able to work came with a cost, literally. The clothing they received was not a gift, but was instead to be deducted from their future earnings. This aspect of the village highlighted the dual nature of their new reality. While they were free, their lives were still bound by the economic constraints of the time. Even in freedom, they were reminded that survival required labor, and their transition to independence would be marked by the same economic challenges that had defined their past. The broadside captured the essence of Freedmen's Village, a place of refuge and renewal, yet one that operated within the constraints of a society still grappling with the complexities of freedom and equality. The village was a microcosm of the larger struggle for civil rights, where the ideals of freedom were constantly weighed against the practical realities of a nation in transition. The structured system put in place aimed to help the freedmen regain their footing and build lives of independence, but it also underscored the challenges they would continue to face in a world that was still far from equal. So the superintendent of freedmen, this guy was super detailed, like really into paperwork. Every month he had to send a big old report to the chief quartermaster. This report had everything: who came into the village, who left, their age, if they were a man or woman, where they used to live, how they were doing when they got there, and where they were headed next. If someone died, the report got into all the gritty details, like how old they were and what they died from. The quartermaster general and his crew kept an eye on things, making sure everything was running like it was supposed to. If anyone in the village had a beef, it got written down and sent up the chain for review. The superintendent also kept tabs on everyone working in the farms or workshops. He tracked every little thing: clothes, food, shelter, fuel. Everything was counted against their earnings, and the work they did was credited. He sent a summary of all this to the chief quartermaster every month. Oh, and it wasn't just about the people. The superintendent had to report on all the tools, supplies, and other stuff he managed. He used special forms for this, and if anything was running low, he'd mark it with a red circle so the bigwigs knew it was urgent. Over on the government farms, there was another superintendent keeping track of hours worked by everyone, broken down by race and gender. This guy made sure the farmers in charge of each farm followed the rules and reported back regularly. The village hospital was run by surgeons appointed by the medical director of the Department of Washington. These surgeons set the rules for how the hospital worked, making sure the freedmen got consistent and effective care. The superintendent of freedmen also made sure there were extra supplies, like for the sick or funerals. He kept tabs on this stuff to avoid running out. Every able-bodied person had to work daily, unless they had a note from the surgeon in charge saying they were too disabled to work. If anyone refused to work, their case got reported up the chain. The American Tract Society ran the schools, making sure kids under 14 got an education. School started at 10 a.m., broke for lunch at noon, and ended at 4 p.m. In the winter, no kid under 14 could skip school unless they were sick. Adults could attend night school too, no matter where they worked during the day. If older kids wanted to attend day school, they needed a permit from the superintendent, but only if their labor wasn't needed. No one was allowed to enter the school without a pass from the superintendent, and kids out of school during school hours would be taken back by the guard. The superintendent reported on the schools each month, covering everything from attendance to any other details the chief quartermaster might need. Plus, the police, under the superintendent's orders, patrolled the village to keep things in check. Finally, the superintendent sent in inspection reports every month, making sure everything in the village was carefully managed. It was a lot of work, all to keep the village running smoothly while balancing the new freedom of its residents with the harsh realities of the world around them. So imagine living in a place where you can't just leave whenever you want. Yeah, like being grounded, but way more intense. In Freedmen's Village, you needed a special pass to go anywhere. And guess what? The camp bosses were like those super strict parents who control your Wi-Fi. They used their power over things like food and clothes to make sure everyone worked hard. If you didn't do your chores, you could kiss your dinner goodbye. But hey, if you paid your rent and taxes, yep, even they had bills, you were pretty much safe from losing your stuff. But hold up. Things didn't always go smoothly. The military paychecks were about as reliable as an internet connection during a storm, which meant that paying those bills on time was a real headache. Talk about a bummer, right? On December 3rd, 1864, this guy, Captain J.M. Brown, decided to crack down on some shady business going on in the village. Imagine someone sneaking out your favorite hoodie or phone charger and selling it to a random peddler. Yeah, not cool. So the guards were told to nab anyone buying or selling stuff like rags or old clothes. And if someone tried to sneak out with government property like a stove or a mattress, how do you even sneak out a mattress? They better have a written note from the boss or they were in big trouble. The whole place had to be kept super clean and tidy like your room when your parents are on your case. And if you left a mess, you could get kicked out, no questions asked. They had rules about everything. No drawing on the walls, no messing up the gardens, and definitely no letting trash pile up or you were out. If you left the village to find work somewhere else, you couldn't just waltz back in unless you had proof your boss was a total jerk. So, yeah, once you were out, it wasn't easy getting back in. Now, let's talk about the rules. They had 3 levels of punishment, kind of like a video game. For little stuff like being late or not cleaning your space, you'd lose your sugar rations, so no dessert for 5 days, and you couldn't leave the camp. If you did something worse, like getting drunk or stealing, you had to face a big-time commission, like a council of teachers deciding your fate. They could take away your privileges, fine you, or even lock you up for a while. But no one was allowed to get physically hurt, which was a pretty decent rule. These rules were posted everywhere, so nobody could say they didn't know. And when visitors showed up, everyone had to be super nice, like your parents telling you to be on your best behavior when guests are over. The idea was for visitors to leave thinking, wow, this place isn't so bad after all. Okay, so picture this. Henry Watson, born in 1813, just a stone's throw away from Fredericksburg, Virginia. Now, life wasn't exactly sunshine and rainbows for Henry. Nope, not even close. He was stuck in slavery for 26 years, and let me tell you, it was a rough ride. Imagine getting grounded for 26 years, but instead of losing your phone, you're getting beaten, starved, and treated like dirt. Yeah, not cool. Henry's life was pretty much a non-stop nightmare. He got beat up more times than Bart in detention, didn't have enough food or decent clothes, and was forced to live in conditions that would make even a dirty old sock feel fancy. But the wild part, Henry somehow found a way to be sort of okay with it. Not because it was okay, but because he didn't know anything else. It's like thinking cafeteria food is gourmet because you've never tasted anything better. That's how messed up his situation was. But here's the thing. Henry wasn't just going to sit around and take it forever. No way. Even though running away from slavery was like trying to escape from a maximum security prison with lasers and guard dogs, Henry decided to risk it all for freedom. And guess what? He made it. That takes guts, people. Serious guts. Now, after the whole emancipation thing, aka when slavery was officially over, life didn't just magically become awesome for Henry and folks like him. Nope. They still had to deal with a ton of challenges, kind of like leveling up in a video game only to find out the next level is even harder. They were free, but they had to start from scratch in a world that was still pretty much a jerk to them. Henry's story is like a reality check, a reminder that surviving slavery was only the beginning. The folks in Freedmen's Village had to be as tough as nails, just like Henry, to push past their trauma and make something of their new lives. It's like trying to rebuild your life after getting your butt kicked by the biggest bully in school. It takes a whole lot of strength, determination, and maybe even a little luck. So imagine you're living back in the day, like way, way back, and you're stuck in the worst possible situation. That's where Henry Watson was. He's this guy who had a seriously rough life, born into slavery, which is like being grounded for life, but a million times worse. We're talking no video games, no snacks, just endless chores, and getting treated like dirt. And by dirt, I mean really, really bad. Now, Henry wasn't just dealing with the usual tough stuff. His life was like one big nightmare. There were these crazy punishment stocks that the mean bosses used to keep people in line. Imagine being stuck between two giant logs that pin you down so you can't move. Yeah, not fun. And these logs weren't exactly comfy. More like the worst bed ever, with splinters included. If someone tried to escape or sneak a snack, okay, maybe it was stealing, but hey, they were hungry. The punishment got even worse. They'd lock you up in iron stocks with big old padlocks, making sure you couldn't go anywhere. It was like being in the ultimate timeout, except with chains and no snacks. Henry's story doesn't just show how bad things were. It also shows how brave he was to even think about escaping. And even when folks like him made it to freedom, life wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. They had to figure out how to live in a world that didn't exactly roll out the welcome mat. One time, Henry had to watch as another slave named Joe got into big trouble with the boss. Joe made a run for it, but the boss was like, "No way," and ordered his henchmen to take Joe out. Joe was just trying to catch one last glimpse of his family when he got caught, and, well, it ended badly. The boss even left Joe's body out as a warning to everyone else, which is just about the worst way to send a message. Henry saw all this and felt completely helpless. It was a seriously dark time, and the fear of what might happen next was always hanging over everyone. But even in this awful situation, Henry and others like him managed to hold on to some hope and courage, which is pretty amazing when you think about it, okay? Picture this. You're stuck in a life that's nothing but hard work and zero fun. That's how it was for Henry Watson as a slave. Every day was like being in a never-ending gym class where you don't get to stop, and there's always some mean coach yelling at you to work harder. But instead of just push-ups, you're doing brutal labor from sunrise to sunset. And instead of getting a break, you're dealing with punishments that make detention seem like a vacation. Now, here's the real kicker. Henry saw some seriously messed up stuff, like his buddy Joe, who tried to make a run for it, thinking, "I've had enough of this." But then, bam, Joe gets caught, and it doesn't end well. It's like one of those horror movie scenes where you're yelling at the screen, "Don't go in there." But Joe went for it, and things went downhill fast. Then there's the daily grind. Imagine waking up super early to a blaring horn, not because school's starting, but because you're about to spend the entire day working in the fields. No Wi-Fi, no chill time, just nonstop work. And if you didn't move fast enough or try to take a break, you'd be in big trouble. We're talking getting locked up in the slave version of after-school detention, but with whips instead of stern lectures. Even on Sundays, yeah, the day that's supposed to be all about rest, there's no break. Instead of lounging around, the women had to haul their laundry to the stream, wash everything, and then get right back to work. And the men, they were stuck doing whatever they could find to keep their hands busy, because if you looked like you were slacking off, it wasn't going to end well. But here's where things get intense. Henry decides to escape, which is like the ultimate real-life break the rules and run moment. He's about to take off when he meets this guy who's like, "Hey, if you can make it to the north, you'll be safe." Henry's thinking, "Wait, what? There's a place where I can actually be free?" So he takes the risk, knowing full well what could happen if he gets caught. It's like that moment when you know you're grounded for sneaking out, but you go for it anyway, because the chance of freedom is just too sweet to pass up. It's like trying to survive the toughest, never-ending obstacle course ever, but with a few brave, crazy moves that just might get you out of it. So, Henry Watson finally makes the big move. He's about to board a ship, and it's like that moment when you're about to leave everything you've ever known behind, he's got a mix of fear and hope bouncing around in his head like a couple of crazy squirrels. Once he steps onto that ship, he knows there's no turning back. It's like he's on the ultimate road trip to freedom, but with no map and no idea what's coming next. When he finally lands in Boston, it's like stepping into a whole new level of the game. The city is completely different. New streets, new people, and nothing like the world he left behind. It's like starting a new school where you don't know anyone, and everything feels weird and scary, but then, just when Henry's feeling totally lost, he meets up with some folks who've been through it all before. They introduce him to this guy, William Lloyd Garrison. Think of him like the ultimate guide who knows all the cheat codes for navigating life as a free man. Garrison takes Henry under his wing and starts showing him the ropes of living free. It's like getting the ultimate crash course in how to make decisions for yourself, no more being bossed around by someone else. Sure, it's not all smooth sailing, there are still some big challenges ahead, but with Garrison's help, Henry's learning how to steer his own ship, figuring out how to live on his own terms for the first time ever. Henry's story is pretty epic, but it's not just his story. There were tons of others just like him, all heading to places like Freedmen's Village, hoping for a fresh start. These are people who've been through the worst and are ready to build something new, a life where they get to call the shots. Freedmen's Village was like this big, welcoming place where they could finally find some peace, make their own choices, and start putting the pieces of their lives back together. So, picture it like this. Henry Watson, and so many others like him, had to face down some seriously tough stuff to get to where they wanted to be. But once they got there, they were all about grabbing hold of their freedom and making sure they lived life on their own terms. It wasn't easy, but with a little help from the right people, they were ready to take on whatever came next. Chapter 4, Arlington's Freedmen's Village, Trials and Triumphs. So, picture this. It's 1863, and there's this place called Freedmen's Village. Now, this wasn't just any village. It was set up by the Freedmen's Bureau on land that used to belong to none other than General Robert E. Lee. Yeah, that guy. Anyway, this village was supposed to be a safe spot for people who had just been freed from slavery, a place where they could start over and figure out what freedom really meant. They even had a school, a church, and their own post office. Pretty cool, right? People living there were trying to get their lives together, farming, selling stuff, and generally just doing their best to move on from the whole slavery thing. But let's be real, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. There were a ton of challenges, like sometimes there wasn't enough food, the living spaces could be a bit cramped, and there were always disagreements between the officials running the place and the people living there. But hey, they were making it work, one step at a time. Freedmen's Village had everything you could think of: bakeries, carpenter shops, blacksmith shops, and even a farm. They grew all kinds of crops like wheat, potatoes, and vegetables, and they had animals like cows and chickens running around. It was basically like one giant community garden meets farmer's market. And get this, the village had a sawmill and a gristmill too, which used to belong to the Union Army but were handed over to the village so folks could keep things running smoothly. Even though the village eventually got shut down in 1900 and the residents moved to other parts of Virginia, Maryland, and D.C., the legacy of Freedmen's Village didn't just vanish. The people who lived there went on to help build other communities, like Shaw, which became one of the first African-American neighborhoods in D.C. So, yeah, the village might be gone, but its impact is still felt. The village wasn't just a bunch of houses thrown together. These were carefully planned homes, with each one having its own front and back doors. The houses were set up around a pond with a dirt road running through the middle. It was all about creating a sense of order and community, making sure everyone had their space but also felt like they were part of something bigger. The whole point of Freedmen's Village was to be self-sufficient. The government wanted everyone there to be working, doing their part to keep things going. And it wasn't just about manual labor. There were opportunities for people to learn trades like blacksmithing, tailoring, and even barbering. The women too were super important, taking on roles as housekeepers, cooks, and maids to keep everything running smoothly. But life wasn't easy, and the people living in the village had to work hard to survive. They were growing tons of vegetables and grains, and were even reuniting families that had been torn apart by slavery. Imagine finally being able to legally marry the person you love and raise your kids without the fear of them being taken away. That's the kind of stability the village was trying to provide. Religion was a big deal in the village, with Baptist and Methodist churches offering not just spiritual support but also a sense of community. The first church, the Old Bell Baptist Chapel, was built in 1863, and it became a central spot for the residents to gather and support each other. Then there were the brave souls from the village who joined the 107th United States Colored Troops, USCT, to fight in the Civil War. Even though they were treated unfairly and faced a ton of discrimination, they didn't back down. They fought in over 400 battles, and some of them even received the Congressional Medal of Honor for their bravery. After the war, many of these soldiers returned to the village, where they settled down, married, and started families. Abbott Hospital was another important part of the village. It was one of the few places that would actually treat black patients, and it became a crucial part of the community. The hospital was run by black nurses and staff, which was a big deal at the time, and it helped make the village a place where people could really start to rebuild their lives. So, yeah, Freedmen's Village was more than just a place to live. It was a community built on hope, resilience, and the determination to create something better. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and it laid the groundwork for the future these freed people were fighting for. So, picture this. Freedmen's Village wasn't just any old neighborhood. It was like starting from scratch, building a whole new life after years of unimaginable hardship. Freedmen's Village was established in 1863 as a safe haven for people who had just been freed from slavery. This was no small deal. It was a big step toward independence for folks who had endured a lifetime of being treated as less than human. Now, this place wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. The village had everything: homes, schools, churches, and even places where people could work and learn new skills. It was like setting up a new town from the ground up. And it wasn't just about the basic stuff like food and shelter, although that was super important. It was about creating a community where people could rebuild their lives with dignity. But, of course, nothing worth having comes easy. The village faced its fair share of challenges. For one, resources were often tight. Imagine trying to make ends meet when there's barely enough to go around. People had to get creative to make things work. And then there was the constant tension between the freedmen and the government officials who ran the place. There were rules, and some of them felt like they were just another way to keep people down. Despite all this, the people of Freedmen's Village didn't give up. They worked hard to make the most of what they had. They farmed the land, started businesses, and built a strong community. They knew that even though freedom had come, they still had a long road ahead to secure their place in a world that wasn't always welcoming. One of the coolest things about the village was how self-sufficient it was. The people there weren't just waiting for someone to give them a handout. They were making things happen. They had their own sawmill, blacksmith shop, and even a farm. They grew their own food, made their own clothes, and basically showed everyone that they could stand on their own 2 feet. But let's not sugarcoat it. The village wasn't paradise. The government still imposed restrictions that made life tough. For example, people had to get permission just to leave or enter the village. It was like they were still being controlled, even though they were supposed to be free. And then there was the issue of wages. Workers in the village had part of their pay deducted to help support others who couldn't work. It was a good idea in theory, but in practice, it just made people feel like they were still being taken advantage of. Despite these challenges, the people of Freedmen's Village kept pushing forward. They were determined to make their freedom count. They fought against unfair treatment, they took care of each other, and they built a community that would lay the groundwork for future generations. Freedmen's Village was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of resilience and hope. The people there weren't just trying to survive, they were building a new life, brick by brick, day by day. And in doing so, they created a legacy that would inspire others for years to come. Okay, so imagine you've just been freed from a life that was unbelievably tough. You and a bunch of other people like you are finally free, but now what? Where do you go? How do you start over? That's where Freedmen's Village comes in. A place that was meant to give people like you a fresh start. This village wasn't just a bunch of random houses thrown together. It was set up on the land that used to belong to Robert E. Lee, the big guy from the Confederacy. Talk about irony, right? The very place that once symbolized slavery now became a sanctuary for those who had just escaped it. The government wanted to make sure that this village wasn't just a temporary stop. They wanted it to be a full-on community where people could live, work, and thrive. The village had schools, churches, and homes, and it was all about giving people the tools they needed to succeed. But, like with anything, there were some serious challenges. The government had a lot of rules, that made life pretty hard sometimes. Imagine not being allowed to leave your own neighborhood without getting permission first. It felt like freedom, but with strings attached. One of the toughest things was that people had to give up a chunk of their pay to help others in the village who couldn't work. It's a good idea in theory, everyone looking out for each other, but it was also frustrating. It felt like, even in freedom, there was still someone telling them what to do with their hard-earned money. But the people in Freedmen's Village were resilient. They took what they had and made it work. They farmed the land, learned new skills, and built a real community. And they didn't just sit around complaining. They fought for better conditions, better pay, and more freedom. They built churches where they could worship and find strength. And they set up schools where both kids and adults could learn. Education was a big deal because it was the key to really making a new life for themselves. Even with all the struggles, the village became a symbol of hope. It showed that even in the toughest situations, people could come together, support each other, and build something better. The legacy of Freedmen's Village is all about that strength and determination, turning a tough start into a new beginning. Okay, so imagine you've just been through the craziest, most intense time of your life. You're finally free, but now you've got to figure out what's next. That's where Freedmen's Village comes in. This place wasn't just some random spot. It was prime real estate, which was super rare for African American communities back then. Most black communities got stuck in the middle of nowhere, far from cities, or anywhere people actually wanted to live. But the folks in Freedmen's Village got a sweet deal and started building something amazing. Freedmen's Village wasn't just about surviving, it was about thriving. The residents started schools, churches, and all sorts of organizations that helped them connect, support each other, and fight for their rights. Imagine a place where you could hang out with friends, learn new skills, and even get involved in politics. Yeah, this was that place. They built fraternal groups like the Reunited Order of Oddfellows, which sounds fancy, but it was really just a group where people could socialize, help each other out, and even figure out how to make life better for everyone. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. After the Civil War, Freedmen's Village got some serious support from the government to help people start fresh. The residents were pumped, ready to build a future. But things started to get complicated. As time went on, the excitement and support started to fade. People in power were getting tired of the whole Reconstruction thing, and the fight for African American rights wasn't as high on the list anymore. The Freedmen's Village, which started as a symbol of hope, began to face some serious challenges. Some people in charge started seeing the Freedmen's Village as a problem rather than a success. Reports criticized the village, calling it a failed experiment, and there was a lot of grumbling about how much money was being spent. It was like they were looking for any excuse to shut it down. The residents, who had worked so hard to build their community, were unfairly labeled as squatters, which was just a way for others to justify taking back the land. Even with all this drama, the people of Freedmen's Village didn't just roll over. They fought back, organized themselves, and tried to keep their homes. The village wasn't just a place to live, it was a symbol of everything they'd worked for. But the government had other plans. They wanted the land for all sorts of things, like expanding Arlington National Cemetery. Chapter 5, Village Life Unveiled, the heartbeat of a community. So imagine you've just been freed after a lifetime of hard times, and now you're thrown into this new place called Freedmen's Village. It's like a fresh start, but with a lot of challenges still hanging around. This village wasn't just any old place. It was a community where everything was set up to help folks get back on their feet. We're talking schools, work, homes, and even some basic clothes to help them out. Take this one time in March 1868 when Captain Carts got a delivery of 200 pairs of striped shorts and 140 woolen socks. Yep, even something as simple as shorts and socks was a big deal because winter was rough and folks needed to stay warm. They also got shipments of materials to make sturdy pants and other clothes. Everything was about survival, and every little bit helped. Freedmen's Village wasn't just about giving out stuff. It was about helping people build new lives, literally and figuratively. The land they lived on was checked out by a guy named Lieutenant Lomas in 1866, and things were looking pretty decent. People had food, homes were in good shape, and nobody was dealing with major diseases. It wasn't perfect, but it was a solid start. The staff working at the village had their hands full. They had to manage almost every part of life for the residents, dealing with everything from complaints to making sure everyone had what they needed. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. For example, when it came to keeping warm, there weren't enough stoves to go around. People were huddling around tiny fires, shivering through the cold nights. When Lieutenant Rogers checked things out, he saw just how bad it was and ordered more stoves. It didn't fix everything, but it made life a little bit better for the folks there. Food was another issue. The rations they got were supposed to be the same as what soldiers got in hospitals, but in reality, it wasn't nearly enough. People were often hungry, and the food was far from what you call nutritious. Lieutenant Rogers took notes on how bad it was and pushed for changes, but improvements were slow and didn't always come through. In April 1867, the Bureau sent a plumber to the village to fix the water supply. Because what's worse than not having enough water? But even with these fixes, getting clean water was still a struggle, and that made life tough. Living conditions were far from ideal. Buildings were overcrowded, and spaces meant for one thing were being used for everything. Like they turned a schoolhouse into a church and a home for multiple families. It was a good example of making do with what they had, but it also showed just how much more they needed. By May 1867, they started getting the materials they needed to fix up the village, like 8,000 feet of flooring lumber. That's a lot of wood. This was a step in the right direction, helping them make the village a better place to live. Despite all the rules and regulations they had to follow, the people in Freedmen's Village were doing their best to make it work. They had to keep their homes clean, behave themselves, and follow orders. Otherwise, they risked getting kicked out. But even with all these challenges, the village offered something special, a chance to build a new life. It wasn't easy, but it was a start. General Charles Howard and others kept pushing for improvements, like making sure there was enough fuel for the hospital. They were always working to get what was needed, even if it meant buying supplies locally when the government couldn't deliver. In May 1867, they got approval to make some big changes, like moving and setting up buildings from a nearby camp to add more space and resources. They also put out new rules to keep things running smoothly, like not starting fires without permission and keeping the place clean. Life in Freedmen's Village wasn't easy, but the people there were resilient. They faced overcrowding, hunger, and cold, but they stuck it out. With some help from the government and their own determination, they were able to start rebuilding their lives, one step at a time. And even though there were plenty of struggles, Freedmen's Village became a place where people could finally start to feel the freedom they had fought so hard to gain. So, picture this. Freedmen's Village was like this place where newly freed people were trying to figure out life after getting out of a really tough situation. It wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, but folks were working hard to make it work. Meet the matron. Think of her like the head of the household, but for the entire village's home. She was in charge of a lot, like making sure everyone had clean clothes, good food, and a decent place to live. It was her job to keep everything running smoothly, and she had to report everything that went down to the big boss, the superintendent, every month. If anything was off, like if people weren't getting their meals on time, or if the place was a mess, she'd hear about it. But there was more to it. The matron had to keep track of all the clothes, what came in, what got cleaned, and what needed fixing. If the clothes were totally worn out, she'd be part of a team that decided what to do with them, whether to fix them up or toss them out. And no, nobody was allowed to sneak in any alcohol, break the rules, and there'd be consequences. Trouble in paradise. Now, not everything was smooth sailing. There was this person, Mrs. Stowe, who was supposed to be helping out, but she was not doing a great job. The guy in charge, Lieutenant Rogers, wasn't impressed. He noticed that she wasn't taking care of things right. Kids were left on their own, the place was a mess, and the food and clothes weren't up to snuff. He recommended she get the boot and suggested someone better take her place. The great inventory fiasco. Then there was this time when they did an inventory check and realized a bunch of stuff was missing or worn out, like pillowcases, sheets, and even slippers. Some things were just plain worn out, while others had gone missing, leading to a big investigation. They needed to figure out what happened and how to prevent it from happening again. A little mismanagement. Things got even sketchier when it came to money. Rent money wasn't being properly tracked, and that raised some serious eyebrows. General Howard had to step in and order a full investigation to get to the bottom of it. They needed to make sure everyone was playing fair and keeping things above board. Keeping things in check. Everything in the village, like shops, stores, and even the horses and wagons, had to be checked regularly, just like a military base. General Howard was all about making sure everything was well maintained so the freedmen had the best shot at building a new life. He wanted to make sure no one slacked off, so he made it clear that anyone messing up would be held accountable. In a nutshell, Freedmen's Village was a place where people were trying to put their lives back together after a really tough time. It wasn't perfect, and there were some bumps along the way, but folks were determined to make it work. With the right leadership and a whole lot of effort, they were making strides toward a better future, one day at a time. So, imagine you're living in Freedmen's Village, back in the day. It wasn't just about hanging out and having a good time. People had to work hard to make it through each day. Let's talk about General Charles Howard. This guy was like the top boss around here, making sure everything ran smoothly, even though he wasn't getting rich from it. He only made $150 a month, but he put his heart into helping everyone in the village. Wood, horses, and hard times. Keeping the fires burning was a big deal because you needed wood for cooking, heating, and washing. So they brought in two guys, Pete Campbell and George Crevelling, to make sure there was enough wood. They got paid a decent chunk of change, but that wood was crucial to keeping things going. But there was another big problem. The village was short on horses. Back then, horses weren't just for riding, they were like the engines that powered everything. They plowed the fields, carried heavy loads, and made sure the village kept running. But by 1868, the village had more people than horses, and the few horses they did have were old and worn out. It was like trying to run a race with tired, old sneakers. You weren't getting far. General Howard knew they needed more horses, and he kept asking the Freedmen's Bureau for better animals and more food for them, but they didn't come through. The horses that were left kept working until they literally dropped. It was rough, and it made life even harder for everyone in the village. Struggling to keep up. The freedmen in the village had to grow their own food, and they relied on those horses to get the job done. But with the horses in bad shape, it was tough to keep up with farming. The food supplies were tight, and the conditions for the animals were pretty bad. They even tried setting up a new feeding facility, but that wasn't enough to fix the bigger problems. And then, to make things more complicated, the Bureau started cutting costs. They fired workers and expected the residents, many of whom were struggling, to do even more with less. The village had to report every little detail to the Bureau, from how many people were working to how many were getting kicked out. It was a lot of pressure. Helping out and making do. Despite all these challenges, the village still tried to help out other communities nearby. They even lent one of their ambulances to Washington and got some much-needed supplies in return. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped. Land and new beginnings. One of the big goals of the Freedmen's Bureau was to help people own land and become self-sufficient. They surveyed the land around the village and divided it up so that freedmen could rent or buy small lots. Owning land was a huge deal because it meant you could build a future for yourself and your family. But it wasn't easy. When people bought land at places like Barry Farms, they had to fix up the roads, build their own homes, and pay taxes, all with very little help. They had to work together to get it done. The Bureau provided some lumber and a carpenter to help build the houses, but it was up to the freedmen to make it happen. They learned how to build, how to farm, and how to take care of their own land. It was tough, but it was also empowering. For many, this was the first time they had a real chance to own something and create a life on their own terms. The big picture. Freedmen's Village was more than just a place to live. It was a place where people were trying to rebuild their lives after going through some of the hardest times imaginable. It wasn't perfect, and there were a lot of struggles, but the people there were determined to make it work. They faced problems head-on, from managing resources to dealing with the government, all while building a community that could stand the test of time. Building a new life at Barry Farms in Freedmen's Village. So, imagine you're one of the freedmen, and you just got the chance to build your own house. Finally, a place you can call your own. The Freedmen's Bureau hooked you up with some lumber to get started, and even though it wasn't easy, you and your neighbors were all about making this dream a reality. Owning your home meant no more dealing with annoying landlords, and that was a huge deal. Everyone was paying their bills on time because they knew this was their ticket to a better life. Luther Slay, who used to be the guy running the show, noticed how hard you all worked to make your new homes look great. Even with all the challenges, you managed to add some nice touches to your lots, showing off your style and hard work. You didn't just stop there. You got together to build a church for the Baptist community, and even bought land for a Methodist church. Talk about teamwork. Education was a big deal too. You and your neighbors chipped in to create a fund to buy more land and build a school. In just a year, you had a schoolhouse big enough for 150 kids. That school was more than just a building. It was a symbol of your commitment to giving your kids a bright future. Barry Farms wasn't just about surviving. It was about building something lasting for your families. You wanted to make sure your kids had a better shot at life. And through all your hard work, you turned Barry Farms into a thriving community full of hope and determination. Upgrading life at Freedmen's Village. Meanwhile, over at Freedmen's Village, things were changing. At first, you might have been living in government barracks, kind of like basic housing. These places were a step up from the dangerous and dirty huts in Washington and Georgetown, where you used to live, but they weren't exactly home. As the village grew, people started moving into better tenement buildings, which were like upgraded apartments. This shift meant there were fewer barracks, and more of you got to live in nicer homes. These tenements were pretty sweet compared to the old barracks. They had city water, which was way better than what any regular landlord could offer at the same price. Plus, the rent wasn't bad. It was set up so you could pay it off over time, kind of like buying your own place bit by bit. But there was more to it than just nicer homes. The Bureau made sure everything stayed clean and healthy by enforcing strict sanitation rules. Every day, an officer would come around to check on things and make sure everyone was following the rules. This setup didn't just make life more comfortable. It made the whole community feel safer and more stable. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a place to live. It was a fresh start where you could rebuild your life. With better housing, clean water, and a supportive community, you had the chance to move from the struggles of the past to a future where you could stand on your own 2 feet. Imagine this. You're one of the freedmen, fresh out of the chaos of the Civil War, and you're eager to learn, to grow, and to build a life that's finally your own. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a place to live. It was like the ultimate school where you could learn everything from reading to trades that could help you stand on your own 2 feet. Picture it as a big, bustling campus where education wasn't just encouraged, it was essential. In Freedmen's Village, they knew that education was the key to unlocking a better future. They set up schools, gave out books, and made sure everyone, from kids to adults, had the chance to learn. It wasn't just about hitting the books, though. People were also learning how to build communities, start organizations, and even get involved in politics. Yeah, they were getting ready to make some serious changes. One of the big stars in this story was Sojourner Truth. She was a legend, like she was the superhero of her time. When she came to Freedmen's Village, she wasn't just there to teach. She was there to inspire. She showed everyone how to take pride in themselves, stay clean and organized, and work hard to make the most out of their new freedom. She even had a close relationship with President Lincoln, who called her anti-sojourner. That's how much respect she commanded. Now, the freedmen weren't just sitting around waiting for things to happen. They were making things happen. They wanted to learn so badly that they organized their own schools, even when the odds were stacked against them. They built schools, raised money, and even established churches and community centers. Education wasn't just about getting smart. It was about survival and setting up the next generation for success. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The freedmen faced a ton of challenges. A lot of people, especially in the South, didn't want them to succeed. Some folks even tried to burn down their schools and attack their teachers. But the freedmen didn't back down. They knew that education was their ticket to a better life, so they kept pushing forward no matter what. In Washington, D.C., things were a bit better. Freedmen's schools were thriving, and places like Howard University became beacons of hope. Howard was more than just a school. It was a place where freedmen could get a top-notch education, learn skills, and prepare for leadership roles in the future. This was a big deal because it showed what was possible when you had the right support and resources. And then there were the industrial schools. These were like the ultimate job training programs. Freedmen could learn trades like carpentry, sewing, and shoemaking, which allowed them to earn a living and gain independence. These schools weren't just teaching skills. They were empowering people to take control of their lives. It was all about moving from surviving to thriving. Even with all the progress, there were still setbacks. Freedmen's schools faced hostility, violence, and a lack of resources. But the teachers, the students, and the communities refused to give up. They kept pushing forward, knowing that education was the key to breaking free from the past and building a future full of possibilities. In the end, the story of Freedmen's Village and all the schools set up during this time is a story of resilience, determination, and the power of knowledge. It's proof that even in the face of overwhelming odds, education can light the way to a brighter future, and that's something worth fighting for. Hey, gather round. Let me tell you about the big change in work life after the Civil War. So, back then, this thing called slavery ended. Yay! But figuring out how everyone would work after that was a big old mess. The government tried to help the formerly enslaved people, known as freedmen, get their lives together and start fresh. But it wasn't easy. First off, some rich white folks didn't want to let go of their old ways. They thought the freedmen wouldn't work unless forced. So they came up with sneaky tricks to keep control, like sharecropping, which was basically working for your old boss without much choice. It was like a video game where you could never level up. But then this cool guy, General Oliver Howard, came in like a superhero and said, "No way, dudes. The freedmen should get to choose where they work and get paid fairly." He set up new rules so that everyone knew what their job was and how much they get paid. No more of that sneaky, boss gets everything nonsense. To help the freedmen get started, the government tried to break up big old plantations into smaller farms so folks could work for themselves. They even got tools and seeds to start growing their own stuff. Kind of like planting your first garden in Minecraft, but way more serious. The government also made these contracts where the freedmen and the farmers agreed on who does what, and the freedmen were protected from getting ripped off. And guess what? They even started co-op businesses where they could save money and work together. Think of it like a superpowered club where everyone wins. But not everything was awesome. Sometimes people tried to cheat the freedmen out of their pay, or they had to move to different places to find work. The government tried to help by setting up offices where freedmen could find jobs, like a job fair, with a lot more walking. Some freedmen even got to own land thanks to the Homestead Act, which promised them land to build a new life. But, surprise, surprise, things didn't always go as planned. A lot of the land was snagged by others, and many freedmen were too broke to buy their own place. Despite all the problems, the freedmen kept pushing forward. They wanted to prove they could be independent, earn money, and maybe even buy a home. They were like heroes in an epic quest, facing down all the obstacles to create a better life. So, there you have it. A bunch of people working hard to build a new world after the chaos of the Civil War. It wasn't easy, and there were lots of bad guys trying to mess things up, but the freedmen kept going step by step to create something better for themselves and their families. Kind of makes you want to cheer them on, right? Hey, you cool cats, imagine this. You're running a big old village where everyone just got their freedom, but now they need a place to live, food to eat, and doctors when they get sick. Sounds like a lot, right? Well, that's exactly what was happening at the Freedmen's Village after the Civil War. First off, the village was super crowded, like way too many people in a tiny space. It was so packed that sometimes they had to squeeze 3 or 4 families into one house. And these weren't just any families, they included old folks and people who couldn't work. The staff tried their best, but let's just say it wasn't a walk in the park. Now, if you got sick in the village, don't worry. They had doctors and ambulances, well, more like wagons with horses, but still. But here's the kicker. The hospital and village were always sharing people back and forth like a game of hot potato to make room for new patients and keep things running smoothly. It was like trying to fit a ton of stuff into a tiny closet. You just had to keep shuffling things around. Sometimes the village staff had to get creative. They didn't have a lot of beds or supplies, so they had to be super careful about keeping things clean to avoid spreading sickness. They even had to make sure the wood for fires was used just right so it lasted through the cold months. Talk about juggling a million things at once. One time, a guy named James Smith needed a new leg. Yeah, an artificial leg, after he lost his real one to a nasty bug bite that got infected. The village made sure he got it so he could go back to work. They even did the same for other folks who needed help after losing limbs. It was like they were running a medical factory, fixing people up so they could keep going. But not everything was smooth sailing. The staff at the village was always trying to figure out how to do more with less. They had to close down a bunch of the hospitals and dispensaries, fancy word for places to get medicine, because the government was cutting costs. They even made plans to move some of the sick and elderly folks to other places in Washington, D.C., so they could save money. It was like playing a game of musical chairs, but with people's lives. Pretty intense, huh? As time went on, the government wanted to close the village altogether. They started shutting things down bit by bit, like closing hospitals and sending patients to other places. It was tough because not everyone was ready to take care of themselves yet, and the staff knew it wasn't going to be easy. So, in a nutshell, running the Freedmen's Village was a huge challenge. The staff worked like crazy to keep everyone healthy, fed, and safe, but it wasn't always possible to get it right. They had to make tough decisions, sometimes having to send people away or cut back on services. It was a tough gig, but they did the best they could to help everyone build a better life after a really hard time. Chapter 6. Storm Clouds Over Freedmen's Village. So, picture this. There's a guy named Mr. J.H. Reynolds just chilling near Fort Jackson, minding his own business. Suddenly, 4 dudes with muskets show up at his house, making all kinds of threats. Mr. Reynolds freaks out and thinks, hey, these guys must be from the Freedmen's village. So he runs to General Charles Howard, who's in charge of the village, and says, hey, we need to get to the bottom of this. General Howard's right-hand man, Lieutenant Bergevin, quickly gets on the case. He rounds up 3 suspects, Samuel Chesson, Dick Robinson, and George Stout. Yep, they're all from the village. And guess what? Another guy, Thomas Stout, who used to live in the village, is already in jail in Alexandria, Virginia. Talk about a messy situation. But here's the thing. The village wasn't just a peaceful little town. It had its fair share of problems, just like any other place. Crime? Yep, they had that. Overcrowding? Oh, big time. Sometimes things got so cramped that people were living practically on top of each other. And that led to all kinds of trouble. One day, Lieutenant Bergevin asked General Howard for more guards. See, the village was surrounded by crops that people were trying to steal, and the few guards they had just weren't cutting it. Bergevin was like, come on, we need more help. But General Howard wasn't having it. He said, nope, just find a way to catch the thieves and punish them. Ouch. But Bergevin didn't give up. He asked again, saying, seriously, we need more guards. These folks are stealing veggies left and right. The village was already using a bunch of soldiers from the 107th Regiment to keep things in check, but it just wasn't enough. Now, things got even crazier when some black soldiers started sneaking into the village, trying to recruit the freedmen into the army. These guys were supposed to get permission first, but nah, they just did their own thing. Sometimes they even forced people to join, which didn't sit well with the residents. It got so bad that some folks were ready to fight back. Imagine being threatened to join the army or else. Talk about a rough deal. Lieutenant Bergevin really tried to help out the people in the village. He was like their go-to guy, always listening to their problems and trying to get things done. But in the end, his efforts weren't enough. 7 days after asking for more guards, again, he got the boot. Yep, General Howard sent him packing and brought in Captain Lawrence to take over. Captain Lawrence was now the big boss in the village, and Bergevin was left to handle renting land and other small tasks. Bummer. So, despite all the good intentions, things in Freedmen's Village weren't always smooth sailing. There was crime, overcrowding, and some serious tension between the residents and the soldiers. And even though the staff tried to keep things under control, it wasn't always easy. But hey, they did the best they could with what they had. So, here's the deal. Lieutenant Bergevin was in charge of keeping things smooth at the Freedmen's Village, but things started getting a bit messy. People were stealing crops left and right, and the place needed more security. Big time. Lieutenant Bergevin was like, hey, we need more guards. But instead of giving him what he asked for, General Oliver Howard said, nah, let's bring in Captain Lawrence to take over. Yep, Lieutenant Bergevin got demoted. Ouch, right? Even though he wasn't the boss anymore, Lieutenant Bergevin didn't just walk away. He still cared about the folks in the village and wanted to make sure they were taken care of. But soon after the new guy, Captain Lawrence, took over, there was this whole situation with missing corn. Yeah, corn. A board of survey was called in to figure out what was going on. They had to find out why the corn was disappearing and how to fix it. Meanwhile, there's this other officer, Lieutenant Newton, who was also trying to do some good. He wasn't supposed to help people who didn't live in the village, but when he heard about Margaret Lee, a woman whose husband was in jail, he stepped up. She was in a bad spot, needing food and help, so Lieutenant Newton reached out to Captain Lawrence to see if they could do anything for her. It wasn't really his job, but he did it anyway because, he cared. Now, let's talk food. The village was always running low on supplies, and the staff had to make sure everyone had enough to eat. Sometimes that meant rationing food so no one went hungry. But it was tough because crops kept getting stolen. This was a huge problem. Less food meant more trouble for everyone. One day, on August 17, 1866, even after getting demoted, Lieutenant Bergevin dealt with a situation involving a guy named Blackwell and another dude, Henry D. Peyton. Someone accused Peyton of stealing corn, but Peyton was like, hold on, this corn is from my own garden. Lieutenant Bergevin backed him up, saying that stealing wasn't cool and anyone caught doing it would be punished. They might even get sent to another place to find work. Some people didn't want to leave the village to find jobs, so they got themselves arrested instead. Not the best plan, huh? Despite all the chaos, Bergevin kept fighting to keep things in order. It wasn't easy, and sometimes it felt like things were just falling apart. But hey, He was determined to do what he could for the people in Freedmen's Village, even when things got tough. So, imagine this. Freedmen's Village is a place where a lot of formerly enslaved people are trying to start new lives, but not everything is going smoothly. Lieutenant Bergevin, the guy in charge, notices that some folks are getting into trouble. Why? Well, some of them are out of work, and when they get hungry, they think it's okay to take stuff from the farms where they used to be forced to work. They feel like they deserve a piece of the pie, or corn in this case, because they put in all the hard work before. So when they're caught swiping crops, they're like, hey, this is ours anyway. But here's the thing. Even though they don't see it as stealing, the law doesn't agree. When these folks get caught, they're thrown in jail, fined, or sometimes even forced to work for others without getting paid. Not cool, right? Now, the people living in the village aren't just sitting around doing nothing. They're frustrated and they want answers. They get together and write a letter to General Charles Howard and Lieutenant Bergevin saying, hey, can we stay here for one more year? We need some time to get ready for the next season. See, the government had a habit of kicking people out of the village if they couldn't pay rent or if they were trying to make room for new folks. So these freedmen wanted to make sure they weren't suddenly shown the door. They also asked, can you do something about all the stealing going on? It was hard for them to prove who was taking their stuff because the rules back then required the owner to have proof, even if they didn't see the theft happen. No one wants to be robbed. And without proper security, their things were always at risk. But wait, there's more. The freedmen said, how about helping us find better jobs? We're working hard, but we're not getting paid enough to live on. Also, could you send more food? What we have isn't cutting it. Finally, they asked for someone to be placed in the village to act as a go-to person for all their questions and concerns. They wanted someone who could listen to their problems and actually do something about them. Captain Lawrence, the new guy in charge, was renting out land to people and thought the freedmen were doing their best with what they had. These folks weren't just sitting around. They were trying to make things better for themselves and their families. They were taking action, pushing for better living and working conditions. But here's the kicker. They had to rent land that was supposed to be theirs after being freed. Talk about a raw deal. Then there's this wild story about a freedman named Judson who managed to hold on to a farm called Frog Nest, even though a white guy named J.S. Budd was trying to claim it was his. Budd's lawyer contacted the Freedmen's Bureau, but they didn't have any real proof that Budd owned the farm. It's likely that Judson's connection to Freedmen's Village kept him safe from getting kicked off the land, or worse. And things don't stop there. On April 6, 1867, a doctor named Armstrong started complaining that some of his cows had gone missing or been killed. He didn't have any proof, but thought the freedmen living in the village might be behind it. Lieutenant Rogers was sent to check it out, but without any real evidence, it was hard to say what really happened. So, picture this. Back in the day, whenever something went missing, like cows, crops, or anything valuable, people were quick to point fingers at the freedmen, the formerly enslaved folks. This was mostly because of the unfair stereotype that they were always up to no good. Even if someone else was causing trouble, the freedmen usually got the blame. Take Dr. Armstrong, for example. He lost a couple of cows and some other stuff, and right away he was like, it must have been those freedmen. But here's the thing. It could have been anyone. Maybe it was some sneaky white supremacist trying to mess things up for the freedmen. Who knows? But Dr. Armstrong was sure it was someone from the village. So, what did the bigwigs do? They sent Lieutenant Rogers to check things out. His job was to figure out if any of the freedmen really were involved in the theft. Dr. Armstrong even gave a full description of the stolen cows and other things, like he was trying to make it an episode of CSI, Civil War. He told them to keep an eye out for cows with split ears, a buggy harness with the name Wiltsey on it, and some missing turkeys and fowls. It was like he was creating a missing cows poster. Dr. Armstrong wasn't just making this up for fun. He had a buddy, John Kimball, backing him up. Kimball was like, yeah, this is a big deal. Anyone who would steal from Dr. Armstrong has to be pretty bold, and they better watch out because the doc's not afraid to shoot. He also pointed out that Dr. Armstrong had a couple of freedmen working for him, so maybe they were behind it. But here's the twist. Lieutenant Rogers did his detective work and found zero evidence that any freedmen from the village were involved. That's right, nada. No one saw anything, and there was no proof at all. Just because Dr. Armstrong's stuff went missing didn't mean the freedmen did it. Now, when it came to keeping stuff safe in the village, General Oliver Howard had some thoughts. He was like, hey, if you're worried about your stuff getting stolen, maybe you should have taken better care of it in the first place. He also pointed out that if they had more guards, this might not have happened. And he had a point. If they'd protected their property better, maybe things wouldn't have gone missing. The Board of Survey, a group of people who checked into this kind of stuff, was supposed to figure out who was responsible for the lost property. They needed to know things like when the stuff went missing, whether it was valuable, and if the people in charge did their job protecting it. But it looked like they didn't get all the facts straight. General Howard was like, hold on, we need more info before we just let this slide. He wasn't about to let anyone off the hook that easily. So, the moral of the story? Don't jump to conclusions and blame people without proof. And if you got something valuable, make sure you protect it so you're not stuck pointing fingers when it goes missing. So, here's the deal. Freedmen's Village was like a giant neighborhood where people who had just been freed from slavery could live and get back on their feet. They had houses, food, clothes, and even schools and doctors. Sounds pretty sweet, right? But like any neighborhood, not everyone was on their best behavior. Let's start with General Charles Howard. This guy was in charge of keeping everything in order at the village. But, like a school principal dealing with unruly students, he had to figure out what to do with some residents who were causing trouble. We're talking about people who wouldn't follow the rules, got into fights, or just didn't want to play nice with others. General Howard wrote a letter to the higher-ups, kind of like asking the principal's office for advice on how to handle these bad apples. He wanted to know if he could kick people out of the village or even punish them when they were acting up. Some folks were so out of control that they needed to be watched constantly to stop them from causing harm to others or even attacking the staff. The general wasn't messing around. He wanted the place to run smoothly, and these troublemakers were making it tough. The response? The higher-ups basically said, go for it. Do what you need to do to keep the peace. They gave him the green light to make some rules and even get rid of the folks who were stirring up trouble. It was all about keeping the village a safe and peaceful place for everyone. Now, let's talk about one guy in particular, David Glasgow. This dude was known for spending his days drunk and not doing much else. He was like that one neighbor who's always causing a scene and never contributing anything positive. People in the village were supposed to be working hard to rebuild their lives, but Glasgow, he was just wasting away and setting a bad example for everyone else. The village wasn't just a free ride. It was supposed to be a stepping stone to a better life. Most people got that and made the most of it. But guys like Glasgow, they were missing the point. And while it wasn't the norm, there were a few others like him who made things tough for the staff and the well-behaved residents. So, what's the takeaway here? Even in a place designed to help people out, you're always going to have a few who don't get with the program. But thanks to General Howard and the rules he put in place, most folks in the village were able to focus on what really mattered, building a better future. So, picture this. Freedmen's Village was supposed to be a safe place for people who were just freed from slavery, like a community where everyone could get back on their feet. But just like any neighborhood, not everything was perfect. Some folks, like a guy named Louis Gaskins, felt like they were being treated unfairly. He wasn't happy with how things were going. He said the food was bad, and he felt like the people in charge were just plain mean. Gaskins wasn't the only one feeling this way, and the word got all the way to the big bosses in Washington. Now, about that wood situation. It's December 24th, 1867, and the village is running out of wood, which is a huge problem because, well, it's freezing cold. Dr. Howard, the guy in charge of making sure things don't fall apart, was told to figure out what happened. Turns out, nobody had made any plans to keep the wood supply coming during the summer and fall, so by winter, they were in a real mess. Some folks even started chopping down trees or stealing wood from others just to stay warm. Dr. Howard had to step in, get a deal with a local supplier, and set up guards to make sure nobody was sneaking off with the wood. He also warned everyone that if they got caught stealing, they'd be in big trouble. Now, let's talk about Reverend Danforth Nichols, a guy who came to the village thinking he could help. He was a missionary, someone who wanted to teach and guide people. But here's the thing. He and others like him didn't really get what life had been like for the freedmen. They thought they knew what was best and sometimes treated the residents like kids who needed to be told what to do. They couldn't understand why the freedmen didn't always follow the rules of chastity and honesty the way Nichols thought they should. Then there was this really upsetting incident involving a woman named Lucy Ellen Johnson. On January 14, 1864, Lucy was brought to the house of Mrs. Barker, the wife of a reverend, in a terrible state. She was crying, shaking, and clearly in pain. Her hands and arms were covered in marks from being tied up, and she was pretty much a mess. Lucy explained that the guards at the village had tied her to a tree and treated her horribly. Lucy's husband had left her in the village, hoping she'd be safe and could earn her keep like everyone else. But when she got there, she was too sick to work right away. She asked for some basic stuff like food, a mattress, a blanket, shoes, and a dress because she wasn't feeling well. Mr. Nichols, who was supposed to help her, didn't like that. He found out her husband was making $25 a month, and he couldn't understand why she needed help. This situation shows that even in a place that was supposed to be a refuge, things could get really messed up. People like Lucy didn't always get the help they needed, and sometimes they were even mistreated. It's a reminder that even when people try to do good, they can mess up if they don't really understand the people they're trying to help. Imagine living in a place that's supposed to be a safe haven, but instead, you find yourself facing some of the worst treatment imaginable. That's what happened to Lucy Ellen Johnson in Freedmen's Village, a place where freed slaves were supposed to rebuild their lives after the Civil War. So here's the story. Lucy's husband left her in the village, thinking she'd be safe and able to start working when she felt better. But things didn't go as planned. Lucy was sick and couldn't start working right away, so she asked for some basic things like food and a bed. Mr. Nichols, the guy in charge, wasn't too happy about that. He found out her husband was making some money and couldn't figure out why Lucy needed help. Instead of talking things out, he lost his cool. When Lucy tried to explain herself, Mr. Nichols got really angry. He grabbed her by the shoulder, shoved her into a chair, and forced her to stay there even when she tried to stand up. Things only got worse from there. A guard came in, dragged Lucy out, and a whole group of soldiers joined in. They didn't just escort her, they pushed her, kicked her, and even choked her. At one point, they tied her up by her thumbs and left her hanging from a tree. Can you imagine the pain? But they didn't stop there. They tied her up again, this time by her wrists, and continued to hurt her, trying to shut her up by stuffing dirty wool in her mouth. This nightmare went on for what must have felt like forever. When they finally let her down, Lucy was told to stay out of Mr. Nichols' sight if she didn't want more trouble. The worst part? She had nowhere else to go. This story shows how, even in places that were supposed to be safe, freedmen, and especially free women like Lucy, weren't always treated with the respect and care they deserve. Instead of getting the help she needed, Lucy faced cruelty from the very people who were supposed to protect her. This chapter reminds us that the road to freedom wasn't easy or fair for everyone. Even in a place meant to help them, people like Lucy Ellen Johnson had to deal with some really harsh realities. A father's nightmare, Lucy. Ellen Johnson wasn't just facing this awful situation alone. Her father, Fielding Lewis, saw it all happen and tried to stop it, but things went from bad to worse. Here's what happened. Lucy's father, Fielding, saw his daughter being dragged to a tree by the guards, and he knew something terrible was about to happen. He begged them to stop, but they didn't listen. Instead, they tied Lucy up by her wrists and thumbs, hoisting her into the air so that her entire weight was hanging from her arms. Imagine the pain she must have felt, dangling there helplessly. Fielding watched in horror as the guards started beating Lucy. One of the soldiers even attached a sword to the end of his gun, threatening to stab her if she didn't stop trying to defend herself. But Lucy wasn't just being threatened, she was actually being beaten, kicked, and whipped, all while hanging from the tree. When Lucy cried out for mercy, they didn't stop. Instead, they stuffed rags into her mouth to keep her quiet. The whole ordeal felt like it lasted forever to Fielding. He said it was so long that he could have walked a whole mile while they were beating her. For a father, standing there powerless and watching his daughter go through something so brutal must have been heartbreaking. This chapter really shows just how tough things were for people like Lucy and her father. Even when they did everything they could to stand up for themselves, they still faced unimaginable cruelty. It's a reminder that the fight for freedom and dignity wasn't just about legal rights. It was about surviving in a world that didn't always see them as human. Lucy Ellen Johnson's story wasn't just something that happened in the shadows. People knew about it, and they weren't going to stay quiet. Louisa Jane Barker, who had witnessed part of what happened to Lucy, made sure her testimony was filed with the Bureau, the government agency that was supposed to protect freedmen. But Louisa wasn't the only one who spoke up. 19 other people also came forward telling their side of the story and backing up everything Lucy and her father had said. And it didn't stop there. The Bureau's files were filled with testimonies from more than 30 other people who talked about similar things happening at Freedmen's Village and Camp Barker. These weren't just one-off events. This was something bigger and much more disturbing. The stories they shared painted a really dark picture of what life was like for freedmen, even in places that were supposed to be safe. What all these voices were saying was clear. There was a serious problem, and it wasn't going away on its own. The abuse and cruelty weren't just isolated incidents. They were part of a system that treated freedmen like they didn't matter. But by coming forward, these witnesses were shining a light on what was happening and demanding that things change. This chapter is about how important it is to speak up, especially when something isn't right. It shows that even when things are tough and the odds are stacked against you, there's power in coming together and making sure the truth is heard. It's a reminder that the fight for justice is often long and hard, but it's a fight worth having. In January 1864, things were tough for the Cook family in Freedmen's Village. Henry Cook was a shoemaker, just trying to make a living and take care of his family. But one day, everything got turned upside down when his son, Charles, fell ill and couldn't go to work. That's when Mr. Simpson, a white administrator at the village, decided to throw his weight around. Simpson wasn't the type to take no for an answer, especially from a freedman. He didn't care that Charles was sick. He wanted him out working, no excuses. When Charles couldn't do it, Simpson lost his cool. He started shoving Charles around, not caring about how weak he was from being sick. Henry and his wife begged Simpson to stop, but it was like talking to a wall. Simpson finally backed off, but not without making a nasty threat. He said he'd have Charles thrown in the guardhouse if he didn't work. After that, Henry tried to calm down. He turned away from Simpson, sat down in his tent, and picked up a peg cutter, a tool he used for his shoemaking. But when he looked back, there was Simpson, standing there with a big stick and a look that could kill. Simpson wasn't done being a bully. He taunted Henry, asking what he was planning to do with the peg cutter, clearly trying to pick a fight. Henry knew things could get ugly fast. He told Simpson that the peg cutter was just a tool, nothing more. But then he flipped the question back on Simpson, asking what he was planning to do with that big stick. Instead of backing off, Simpson went full rage mode. He called Henry a terrible name and ordered him to step outside the tent, threatening to beat him with that stick. As soon as Henry stepped out, Simpson attacked. He hit Henry in the back of the head and then slammed the stick down again, almost knocking him out. But Henry wasn't going down without a fight. Simpson threw the stick at him, and before anyone knew it, the two were wrestling on the ground. In a desperate move, Henry managed to get the upper hand and threw Simpson to the ground, defending himself the only way he could. Things got even worse for Henry Cook after the first fight with Mr. Simpson. After Henry managed to defend himself, Simpson wasn't about to let it go. He called for backup, and pretty soon, Mr. Fowler, another white administrator, and a guard showed up. Together they held Henry down so Simpson could keep attacking him without anyone stopping him. Simpson, now feeling even more powerful, pinned Henry to the ground, pushing his knees into Henry's chest. He didn't just want to hurt Henry. He wanted to really mess him up. Simpson started punching Henry in the face over and over, and even tried to gouge out his eyes with his thumbs. It was only when things got really serious that Fowler stepped in, stopping Simpson from permanently blinding Henry. After the vicious beating, Simpson got on his horse and with no care in the world, told Henry to get back to work. But Henry, who could barely stand after what happened, told Simpson he wasn't going to work for him anymore. The beating had left Henry so badly hurt that he had to stay in bed for about 2 weeks, trying to recover from the pain and injuries. Henry's wife, scared for her husband and angry about what had happened, went to Captain Perry to report what Simpson had done. But instead of getting the help they needed, Captain Perry told her to keep quiet and not make any trouble. He basically shut her down, acting like what happened wasn't a big deal at all. This whole situation shows just how tough life was for freedmen like Henry Cook, even in places that were supposed to protect them. Captain Perry's response made it clear that there were still people who didn't care about what happened to freedmen and weren't willing to stand up against the abuse. But things didn't end there. About 3 weeks after Simpson's brutal attack, Nichols, another white administrator at the village, came to Henry with bad news. Henry and his family were being kicked out of the village. The reason? Henry had refused to work for the government after his fight with Simpson. It didn't matter that Henry was hurt and trying to recover. They were being evicted with no money and nowhere to go. So here's what was really going on with the guys who made Henry Cook's life a living nightmare. Thomas Simpson, the guy who beat Henry up, wasn't just any random dude. Before the Civil War, Simpson had been a slave driver in Maryland, making money by hiring out enslaved people like they were just tools. He knew how to use violence to get what he wanted, and even after the war, he kept that same nasty attitude. Philip Fowler, the guy who helped hold Henry down while Simpson did his thing, also had a sketchy past. He worked for the big boss of the government farms, Edward A. Holman. Just like Simpson, Fowler had been in charge of enslaved people back in the day, using force to keep them in line. So, you can see where these guys were coming from. They were used to being in control and using their fists to stay in charge. Then there's Nichols, the pastor who should have been helping people, but instead used his power to make life harder for the freedmen. Even though he was supposed to be someone they could trust, Nichols had a rep for treating people badly, especially the newly freed folks who looked up to him for support. These three, Simpson, Fowler, and Nichols, were still stuck in their old ways, holding on to their power and using it against people like Henry. They didn't care that the world was supposed to be changing, that freedom was supposed to mean something. Instead, they just kept on doing what they'd always done, making life miserable for anyone they could control. Henry's story shows how tough it was to actually be free. Even in a place like Freedmen's Village, where people were supposed to be safe, the same old bullies were still in charge and they weren't about to let go of their power. But Henry wasn't going to let them win without a fight. Finally, Lieutenant Green, who'd had enough of Nichols and his dirty dealings, decided to move him out. He sent Nichols to a camp on Mason's Island, now called Roosevelt Island, basically telling him to get lost. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was a start. Chapter 7, The Final Blow. Government Eviction. So, here's the deal. Back in January 1864, things took a rough turn for the freedmen living near Arlington House. Lieutenant Charles Shepard, who was like the top cop for the 1st Massachusetts Heavy Artillery, got orders to clear out the area in front of the big, fancy estate. Why? Because Lieutenant Colonel Lathrop didn't like how the freedmen's homes were messing up the view. Yep, you heard that right. The whole problem was that their houses were making the place look less pretty. So what did they do? They told the freedmen to pack up and move to another spot. But hey, at least they let them rebuild in a different part of the village, which wasn't exactly great, but better than nothing. About 15 to 20 new houses popped up, and around 100 people called these places home. This whole mess shows how the people in charge cared more about how things looked than about the actual lives of the freedmen. Even though they'd been freed from slavery, they still had to deal with being pushed around like they didn't matter. But like they always did, the freedmen found a way to bounce back, build new homes, and keep their community going, even when the odds were stacked against them. But hold on, it didn't stop there. After they got settled into their new digs, some Union military guys started whining about them stealing and wanted them moved even further away from his fort. This led to yet another eviction. Lieutenant Shepard tried to stand up for them, asking the other military leaders to just let them stay put, but nope, nobody listened. The freedmen had two choices: move their stuff again, or get thrown into a contraband camp, which was basically like a low-key prison. Now, Freedmen's Village wasn't just any camp, it had grown into a real community. Contraband camps, on the other hand, were pretty much the worst, places where freedmen were kept in terrible conditions, like they were still prisoners. The village was way better than that, but if they didn't move, they'd end up in one of those grim camps. Then there's Miss Donaldson, a white lady who was one of the few folks actually standing up for the freedmen. She was loud and proud about it too, but her support didn't sit well with the powers that be, so they cooked up some bogus charges, calling her a woman of bad character, and threw her in jail in Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Shepard tried to defend her, saying she was a good person, but the damage was done. Her arrest ticked off the freedmen so much that they marched to Washington in protest on the day she got locked up. The stand in the cold, fighting for dignity. So, picture this. A bunch of freedmen are protesting, standing up for what's right. But it's freezing outside and they're forced to stay out in the cold all night, surrounded by guards who are just waiting for them to give up and go home. Sadly, one of the freedmen couldn't handle the harsh weather and ended up dying. But even with all that, the freedmen refused to back down. They weren't just fighting the cold, they were fighting for their dignity and to show that they wouldn't be pushed around anymore. This whole situation just shows how tough things were between the freedmen and the Union military officials, who seemed more interested in keeping things convenient for themselves than in doing what was right. Paying rent, the constant struggle. Now let's talk about money. On June 30th, 1865, Captain Carse collected a total of $344 in rent from the residents of Freedmen's Village. Living there wasn't free. Everyone had to pay rent for their little homes, which was a big deal for a lot of people who didn't have much money to begin with. Sure, some of the freedmen could pay, but a whole bunch of them just couldn't afford it, especially the ones who were unemployed, disabled, or elderly. These were folks who already had it rough, and having to worry about rent on top of everything else was just too much. Even though a lot of people couldn't pay, the Freedmen's Bureau still made sure everyone had food and supplies. They knew that kicking people out would be a disaster, so eviction was only used when there was no other choice. But just the idea of getting evicted hung over everyone's heads like a dark cloud. A plea for help. Langerfield Beverly's letter. One day, on September 28, 1865, a freedman named Langerfield Beverly was so worried that he wrote a letter straight to President Andrew Johnson. Langerfield was in a really tough spot. He was poor, couldn't walk well, and had been depending on the government to survive for the past 4 years. In his letter, he pretty much begged for more help, saying that his situation was bad and that anyone who doubted him should just trust in the good Lord because everything he said was true. Langerfield's letter really showed how desperate things were. He explained that he, his sick wife, and his kids were all on the edge of getting kicked out of their home in the village. Just thinking about their stuff getting thrown out onto the street was enough to make anyone panic. His plea was like a snapshot of how life was for a lot of freedmen back then. They had been promised freedom and help, but they were still struggling like crazy, depending on the decisions of government officials who held their futures in their hands. Langerfield Beverly struggled for survival. So, Langerfield Beverly was a freedman who was really going through it. Life wasn't easy after the Civil War, especially for someone like Langerfield, who was trying to make ends meet in a place where not everyone was cheering for his success. In Arlington County, some white folks were cool with African Americans trying to stand on their own 2 feet, but others, not so much. They made it hard for people like Langerfield to get ahead. Now, Langerfield wasn't just sitting around waiting for things to happen. He took matters into his own hands and reached out to the big boss, General Howard, for help. But here's the kicker. Langerfield was told he didn't have a case because he hadn't been officially kicked out of the village. The problem? Langerfield argued that, in reality, he and his family were already out on the streets, with no food and no way to survive. He even got threatened that if he didn't cough up rent for just 1 month, all his stuff would get trashed. And this was after he'd been paying rent like clockwork for 1.5 years. So, what did Langerfield do? He didn't give up. Instead, he asked the Freedmen's Bureau for help to move back to his old stomping grounds in King George's County, Virginia. This wasn't just about finding a new place. It was about taking control of his life and doing what he thought was best for his family. And get this, Langerfield wrote the letter himself. The Civil War had only ended a few months earlier, so for someone who had been enslaved to be able to read and write, that's huge. It shows just how determined and resilient he was. But the story doesn't stop there. Captain Carse was put on the case to look into Langerfield's situation and make sure things were handled fairly. While we don't know exactly what happened next, it was pretty common for the Bureau to help freedmen move out of the village, partly because new people were showing up every day looking for a place to stay. Langerfield's story is a glimpse into what life was like for freedmen trying to rebuild after the Civil War, full of challenges, but also full of determination to make a better life. Cornelius West, a little help from a friend. Then there's the case of Cornelius West. Like Langerfield, Cornelius was in a tough spot. He was about to lose his home in the village because he couldn't pay his rent right away. But Cornelius had a plan. He was starting work the next Monday and would be able to start paying, even if it was just a little at first. Lieutenant Colonel Rogers, a bureau officer, believed in Cornelius and stuck up for him, saying that Cornelius should be allowed to stay in his home because he was trying to get back on his feet. This was a big deal. It showed that not all the folks in power were against the freedmen. Some actually cared and tried to help out. Rogers' support for Cornelius showed that positive relationships could happen between the mostly white bureau staff and the African American residents. It was proof that people could look out for each other, even when the times were tough. Tough choices and hard times. So, even though there were people like Lieutenant Colonel Rogers who had the backs of folks like Cornelius West, the Freedmen's Bureau sometimes had to make some really tough calls to keep things running. This wasn't always fair, and it often led to families being told they had to leave the village. Why? Well, sometimes it was because they couldn't pay rent. Other times, it was to make room for new freedmen who were showing up, desperate for a place to stay. Take, for example, the families of Esther Johnson and Washington. They got to stay in the village for just one more month before they were told to leave. And they weren't the only ones. In November 1866, families like the Hoggins, with their 6 kids, and the Greens, with their 3 kids, along with hundreds of others, were forced out. This wasn't just a few people. We're talking about a lot of families suddenly having to figure out where to go next. These evictions were a part of the Bureau's bigger plan to make sure they could help as many people as possible with the limited resources they had. But here's the thing. It wasn't easy for those who got kicked out. Langerfield Beverly, Cornelius West, and others like them were trying to survive in a world that was supposed to be new and full of freedom, but it was also full of challenges and uncertainty. What happened next? When people were kicked out of the village, they didn't have many options. They had to find somewhere else to live, maybe with family or friends, or just in nearby areas. The problem was, these evictions often happened so fast that people didn't have time to prepare, and the government didn't exactly help them find a new place to stay. This led to a lot of frustration and formal complaints from the freedmen who were affected. Here's what they were mad about. No place to go. The government kicked them out, but didn't give them any help finding a new home or resources to help them get back on their feet. Imagine being told you have to leave, but you don't have anywhere else to go. Pretty stressful, right? No one asked them. The decision to evict them was made without talking to them first. It was like, you're out, with no chance for the residents to have a say in the matter. That made them feel powerless and like they didn't matter. No good reason given. The government didn't really explain why these evictions had to happen. Without any clear reason, it just felt unfair and added to the anger and frustration. Barely any warning. People were told to leave with little to no time to prepare. No heads up, no chance to get things in order. Just go. Lost everything. When they were forced out, many had to leave behind their belongings, and there was no compensation for what they lost. Losing your home is bad enough, but losing your stuff too? That's a big hit. Even though there were a lot of problems with the way the government handled things, some people in the Freedmen's Village tried to help those who were being forced to leave. For instance, Captain Lawrence stepped up to see if Humphrey and Thomas Owens could stay in the village because they had jobs at the cemetery, and Owens' wife was going to work as a cook. This shows that if you had a job connected to the village, you might be able to stay, but if you had to go, they'd at least give you some clothes to help out. The staff at the Freedmen's Village weren't just following orders. They were really trying to look out for the people living there. They knew how tough life was for the freedmen and did what they could to make things a bit easier, even when the government's decisions were harsh. This shows that, while there was a lot of struggle, there were also people who cared and tried to support the freedmen as they worked to build new lives. So, while being kicked out of the village was really hard and caused a lot of pain, it also showed the ongoing fight for freedom, justice, and support that the newly freed African Americans were going through. The complaints and concerns raised by the freedmen make it clear that they needed more transparency, more help, and more respect in how these big decisions were made about their lives. The way people reacted to being forced to leave the village was all over the place. Some were ready to go, hoping they'd find better jobs or be closer to family. But others, like Hannah Trimmer, didn't want to leave because the village had become a stable and safe place for them. Hannah Trimmer's story. Take Hannah Trimmer, for example. She was a 64-year-old freedwoman who had lived in the village since 1864 and always paid her rent on time. Even though she did everything right, she was told she had to leave. Hannah was really upset by this and wrote a letter on November 15, 1866, asking why she had to go. She explained that after coming to the village from the West Indies, her grandson helped her out until he left in 1865. After that, she managed to pay her rent herself, even though she was getting older and it was harder for her to work. Hannah's request to stay in the village was sent to General Oliver Howard, but he said no. She had to leave. This was a tough blow for Hannah, showing how hard it was for many freedmen. Even if they followed the rules and were a part of the community, they could still be forced out with no real consideration of their personal situation or where they go next. When the government decided to kick people out of the Freedmen's Village, not everyone agreed on whether it was the right move. Some white folks thought it was a good idea because it would mean the government didn't have to take care of the freedmen anymore, and maybe it would push them to find jobs and places to live on their own. but others, including a lot of freedmen themselves, were totally against it. Why? Because they were being kicked out of their homes without getting any help to find a new place to live or any kind of compensation. Hannah Trimmer's struggle. Let's look at Hannah Trimmer's story again. For people like her, getting evicted wasn't just about losing a roof over their heads. It meant losing everything they'd worked for, like the stability and sense of community they had in the village. Imagine working hard to build a life, only to have it all taken away without any warning or help. That's what was happening to Hannah and many others. It wasn't just about finding a new place. It was about losing the safety and security they'd finally found after being freed from slavery. A major setback. The government's decision to evict these freedmen was a big blow to the progress they'd made. They were trying to build a self-sustaining community, a place where they could support themselves and each other. But being forced out like this made everything harder. Without any compensation or a clear reason for why this was happening, the freedmen were left to face a really tough and uncertain future. They had to figure out where to go, how to find work, and how to survive all over again. Lieutenant Rogers saw that things weren't being handled right and knew he had to step up. He realized that the way the freedmen were being kicked out of the village was causing a lot of problems, and he wanted to make sure it was done with more care. Rogers teamed up with Captain Lawrence to try and make the process smoother, but he quickly found out that it wasn't happening the way it should. The evictions were still rough and unfair, and the freedmen were left to deal with the fallout. So Lieutenant Rogers starts looking into how the whole relocation thing was handled, and what he finds isn't great. It turns out that nobody really explained what was happening to the freedmen properly. The rules and what was expected of them were kind of a mystery, so it's no wonder people were confused and upset. Rogers also felt that the people in charge, like the Bureau's management, didn't really do enough to make the move seem like a good idea. They didn't give the freedmen enough reasons or support to take the opportunities being offered elsewhere, which led to a lot of resistance from the residents. Many freedmen argued that they didn't even know they were being kicked out until it was too late because they were either at work or away when the eviction notices went up. Imagine coming home from a long day, only to find out you're being forced out with no warning. For families living on the Arlington farm outside the village, it was even worse. If they didn't agree to leave, their homes were just torn down. And if they wanted to keep their homes, they had to move them, which caused damage and cost a lot of money. It was a total mess and really unfair. Why the village mattered. For a lot of these people, the village was the first real place they felt safe and stable since being freed from slavery. They built lives there, with friends, family, and church communities. Leaving all that behind was scary, and many didn't want to do it. The idea of abandoning this newfound stability made them angry and afraid, and some even threatened to fight back or just refuse to leave, which got them into more trouble. The forced evictions led to a lot of freedmen ending up in Washington, D.C. and nearby areas in Virginia. These people had nowhere to go and no money, so they relied on local churches and relief groups for help. But there were just too many people needing help, and those organizations couldn't keep up. To try to fix things, the government came up with a plan. They'd pay for transportation to anywhere that the head of a household had found a job. The idea was that once they were settled and working, they could send for their families to join them. But not everyone thought this was a good idea. Some people said it was just the government's way of getting rid of the freedmen, while others saw it as a chance to start fresh. The biggest issue was that it would mean splitting up families, and a lot of heads of households didn't want to leave their loved ones behind with just a promise they'd be reunited later. In the end, the government's plan to get people to leave the village didn't really work out. Most of the freedmen decided to stay put instead of heading off to an unknown future. Why? Well, they'd already been through a lot and weren't exactly eager to face more uncertainty. The village was their home, the one place where they felt safe after everything they'd been through. They had built a tight-knit community and weren't about to give that up without a fight. Take William Conway, for example. His mother-in-law asked a pretty basic question. If we take down our house, where are we supposed to go? And what did Lieutenant Bergevin say? He called her a damn fool. Not exactly helpful, right? This just showed how out of touch some of the officials were with what the freedmen were going through. Lieutenant Rogers knew there was a problem, but hadn't had the chance to confront Bergevin about it yet. But it was clear these kinds of incidents were making the residents even more stressed out. A night under the stars, but not in a good way. In one particularly rough case, a woman was evicted and had to spend the night outside. No roof over her head, just the cold ground. Lieutenant Rogers couldn't believe how badly the whole eviction thing had been handled. He figured that all the complaints from the residents were totally justified because they'd been put through the ringer thanks to the sloppy way the orders were carried out. Eventually, the higher-ups realized they'd made a mistake. The order to kick everyone out of the village was canceled. Why? Two big reasons. First, the village was actually turning into something pretty special. It was a model community, showing what could happen when the freedmen were given a real shot at making a life for themselves. Second, the Union Army figured out they actually needed the freedmen. They were farming, producing food, and helping keep things running during the war. So, instead of pushing them out, the Army decided it was better to let them stay and keep doing what they were doing. Rogers steps up to help out. Lieutenant Rogers saw that things were going off the rails at the village, so he recommended Captain Lawrence take a closer look at what was going on with the folks who had been forced to leave. Rogers thought that if people could find jobs and support themselves, they should be allowed to come back to their homes. Instead of making more changes to the rules, Rogers suggested focusing on making life better inside the village. This meant fixing up the heating systems, because nobody wants to freeze in winter, hiring a skilled carpenter to fix up the buildings, and making sure the matrons were doing their jobs well so everyone could have a better experience living there. The big idea was to create a place where the freedmen could feel safe and stable without worrying about being kicked out again. Rogers' report shined a light on all the challenges people were facing in the village, like lousy living conditions, not enough food, and poor medical care. He made it clear that things needed to change fast if the village was going to be a decent place to live. The eviction drama. On January 8, 1867, Captain Lawrence got new orders from the Freedmen's Bureau HQ in Washington. They laid out how to go about removing people from the village if they didn't have jobs. The assistant commissioner wanted to cut down on the number of people living there and make sure only those with jobs stayed. The instructions were pretty strict about following the rules to keep things fair. For those with jobs in Georgetown or nearby, they could ask for housing in those areas. That way, they could stay close to work, which would help keep their lives stable. But for those without jobs, this meant they might have to leave the village, which added even more stress to their already tough lives. Rogers' report showed just how tough life was for the freedmen in the years after the Civil War. Even though the Bureau was supposed to be helping them adjust to their new freedom, the way they handled things sometimes made life even harder. Rogers made it clear that unless there were some big changes in how things were run, the village would keep struggling to take care of its people. When it came to removing unemployed people from the village, the process had to be done carefully. Captain Lawrence was told to start by making a list of people who wanted to stay, but had jobs in the city or nearby. This was super important to make sure that those with good reasons to stick around, like being close to work, could do so. The folks in charge at the Freedmen's Bureau weren't just about kicking people out of the village. The assistant commissioner made it clear that the goal wasn't to force anyone to leave against their will. Instead, they wanted to give the residents a shot at finding work, which would help them stay in the community if they wanted to. They knew life was tough for the freedmen, so they aimed to make things a bit easier, not harder. To make this work, Captain Lawrence and his team had to have some serious talks with the residents. They needed to explain that finding a job was crucial. If they didn't, they might have to leave the village. The residents were given 2 weeks to find work, and it was important they knew what was at stake and how much time they had. But it wasn't all black and white. The assistant commissioner also told Captain Lawrence to use some common sense when enforcing the rules. For example, if someone was sick or had a legit reason they couldn't work, they shouldn't be kicked out. The idea was to be fair and avoid making life harder for those who were already struggling. The whole point of this plan was to help the residents become more self-sufficient by encouraging them to find jobs. But the Bureau also knew this goal shouldn't come at the cost of compassion or fairness. They wanted to be humane about the process, recognizing that the freedmen were dealing with the huge challenge of adjusting to life after slavery. Captain Lawrence's job of handling who stayed and who had to go was tricky, especially since the residents had such different situations. He had to make a detailed list of those who were working in places like Virginia and Maryland, but still wanted to stay in the village. This list was sent to headquarters, where the higher-ups would decide if they could keep living in the village, even though their jobs were pretty far away. On that list were 3 guys, Kane Duncan, John Church, and Daniel Hogans, each with their own set of challenges. Duncan worked in Piedmont, Virginia, while Church and Hogans had jobs in Maryland. Duncan and Church lived in village-provided homes, so moving them out was simpler, though still a hassle. But Hogans's case was a whole different story. He owned his own log house in the village. Owning a home was a big deal back then. Especially for a freedman, it meant stability and independence, something most newly freed people didn't have. However, despite this achievement, Hogan's was told he had to leave the village. This wasn't just about losing a place to live, it was about losing the security that came with owning a home. The Bureau's rigid rules didn't really consider special cases like Hogan's, which shows that while they meant well, their approach sometimes missed the mark when it came to supporting those who had worked hard to gain some independence. Even though the Bureau was pushing to reduce the number of people living in the village, they still made room for those who really couldn't support themselves. Take Cornelius Carney, for example. He was an elderly freedman who asked to be admitted to the village on January 8, 1867. Carney had been bouncing around Washington, D.C. without a stable place to stay, and because of his age and health, he couldn't take care of himself anymore. With no family or friends to help him out, he was in a pretty tough spot. Lieutenant Rogers had a tough job on his hands, making sure that everyone in the village had what they needed while also following the government's orders. One case that really shows this balancing act is that of Cornelius Carney. Carney was an older freedman who was living in rough conditions on Fredericksburg Island in Washington, D.C. With no family or support system, he was struggling just to survive. Rogers made sure Carney was brought into the village where he could be taken care of. This wasn't just about giving someone a place to stay, it was part of the Bureau's bigger plan. They wanted the village to support itself by helping people find jobs and become independent. But they also knew they couldn't just abandon those who couldn't fend for themselves, like Carney, so they made sure people like him were looked after, even while they encouraged others to find work and support themselves. The way the Bureau managed the village was pretty complicated. Even though there were lots of field offices around the country, Freedmen's Village reported directly to the big bosses in Washington, D.C. This was likely because the village was a special case. It wasn't just a community, it was also a symbol of the government's promise to take care of those who had been freed from slavery. The story of Carney shows just how hard it was for the Bureau to juggle their goals. They wanted to help people become self-sufficient, but they also had to make sure the most vulnerable weren't left behind. Reverend R.S. Laws, a man of faith and struggles. Reverend R.S. Laws was another person who played a key role in the village. He was a preacher and a student at the National Institute of Education, dedicating his life to helping the people in the village with their spiritual needs. But there was a problem. Since he spent all his time preaching and studying, he didn't have a job that paid him money. This made it really hard for him to make ends meet, especially when it came to paying for a place to live. On March 20th, 1867, Reverend Laws reached out to General Charles Howard with a special request. He explained that his work as a minister of the gospel was really important to the community, but it didn't come with a paycheck. Since he couldn't work another job and still do his ministerial duties, he asked if he could live in his village home rent-free. Reverend Laws made it clear that he wasn't asking for a handout. He just didn't have the money to pay rent. This request highlighted a big issue in the village: the need for the Bureau to find a balance between promoting self-sufficiency and recognizing the vital contributions of people like Reverend Laws. His work was crucial to the community's well-being, even though it didn't bring in any money. The story of Reverend Laws is a great example of the struggles that many freedmen faced. Even though they were no longer enslaved, they still had to deal with the economic challenges and inequalities that came with their newfound freedom. Benjamin Wade, A Story of Resilience. Benjamin Wade's life is another powerful example of the strength and determination that the residents of Freedmen's Village showed every day. Like Reverend Laws, Wade faced huge challenges, but he didn't let that stop him from playing an important role in the community. So imagine being Benjamin Wade, a former soldier who fought hard in the war, only to come back and find that life wasn't exactly rolling out the red carpet for him. Wade was a member of the United States Colored Troops, but after all that action, he was left with a disability that made it impossible for him to do the heavy lifting most jobs demanded. Bummer, right? He tried everything, pounding the pavement, searching for work in the city, but every door was slammed in his face. Why? Because of his disability. It's like getting rejected from every club in town because you can't dance. Wade's financial situation went from bad to worse. His rent was due, and he didn't have the cash to cover it. The only thing keeping him afloat was the occasional military pension check, which wasn't exactly reliable. So, what did Wade do? He decided to go straight to the top and wrote a letter to General Charles Howard, the big boss at the Freedmen's Bureau. Wade laid it all out. his struggles, his determination to contribute to the village in any way he could, and his hope to stay in his home until that pension check finally arrived. It was like one of those Hail Mary passes in football. He was hoping for a miracle. And guess what? General Howard totally got where Wade was coming from. He didn't just toss Wade's letter into a pile. Nope, he actually listened. Howard knew how important guys like Wade were to the village, so he gave him and his wife the green light to stay in their home, even though they were behind on rent. But there was a catch. Wade had to keep doing whatever work he could manage in exchange for a place to live and some food, and when that pension check finally arrived, Wade was expected to pay up and get his account straight. Fair deal, right? This move by General Howard wasn't just about keeping Wade off the streets. It was a big deal because it showed that everyone in the village mattered, not just those who could bring in money or do heavy labor. Wade's story is a perfect example of how tough life was for African Americans after they were freed from slavery. It wasn't just about surviving, it was about finding a way to live with dignity in a world that still didn't treat them right. In the community, well, that was their lifeline. The struggle is real. Wade's letter gave everyone a sneak peek into just how hard things were for folks in the village, especially for those who couldn't work regular jobs because of disabilities. Wade wasn't the only one having a rough time. The village was full of people who were trying to make the best of a tough situation. Despite his own struggles, Wade was always there for his neighbors, helping out wherever he could. This kind of mutual support was what kept the village together, especially when times got tough, like during that brutal cold snap. Wade wasn't just looking out for himself, he was part of something bigger. And Wade wasn't the only one with challenges. Take the story of Elizabeth Brown's daughter. She needed special care, and on July 25, 1867, Dr. Charles B. Purvis, a well-known African-American physician, wrote to the chief medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel Rayburn, asking if she could be moved to the village. It was a tough situation because the village was already stretched thin on resources, but it just goes to show how much the village had to deal with. Medical needs, financial problems, and more. Speaking of money problems, the rent situation in the village was a nightmare. Lots of folks fell behind on payments, with some debts going back to 1866. On March 31, 1868, Assistant Commissioner Stewart Eldridge decided it was time to get things under control. He issued an order that basically said, "Pay up, people." But there was a silver lining. Any rent owed before January 1, 1868 was forgiven. So no one was getting chased down for ancient debts. But if you couldn't pay what you owed by the due date, you were given 30 days before getting the boot. So picture this. It's 1868 and things are getting pretty tense over at Freedmen's Village. Folks are having a hard time paying their rent. Yeah, even back then, rent was a major headache. General Charles Howard, who's basically the guy in charge, was like, "Hey, let's cut these people some slack." He suggested wiping out all the overdue rent before January 3, 1868. Why? Because he believed that with a little push in the right direction, folks would start paying on time in the future. Howard was caught in the middle of trying to keep the village running smoothly and making sure the residents weren't left high and dry. It was a tough balance, no doubt about it. Now, let's talk about some of the village's residents. People like Benjamin Wade and Elizabeth Brown's daughter. These guys were really going through it. The village was a community trying to pick up the pieces after the whole slavery ordeal. But here's the thing. Everyone had to deal with the same old issues, like how to make a living, where to get proper care if you couldn't work, and, of course, how to pay rent. Despite all this, the village residents kept pushing forward, doing their best to keep things together. Then came June 27, 1868. Assistant Commissioner Eldridge dropped some heavy news. They were going to start evicting certain residents from the village. Ouch. But here's the catch. They weren't just kicking people out for no reason. The freedmen who got the boot were being offered jobs either in Washington or right there in the village. It wasn't optional, though. If you said, "Nah, I'm good," you'd be out of the village by July 10th. And this didn't just apply to the adults. Orphans and older kids had to pitch in too. Everyone had to pull their weight unless you were doing something super specialized, like carpentry, which needed real training. If you didn't want to work in the village, you could try your luck up north. But if you turned that down too, you were out by August 3rd, 1868. This whole deal was part of a bigger plan to make the village more self-sufficient and less reliant on government help. It was kind of like a wake-up call. Time to start fending for yourselves, folks. Fast forward to July 20th, 1868. The village leaders were like, hey, let's pump the brakes on selling off some of these buildings. They wanted to give the residents more time to get their stuff together and maybe even buy the land they lived on. But just 2 days later, the answer came back. Nope, sorry. The assistant commissioner's office was firm. Those buildings were going up for sale, no extensions. Some buildings were safe and reserved for freedmen who rented land, but the rest, yeah, they were out of luck. But all wasn't lost. The residents were told they could still appeal to Congress and try to get the land sold or donated to them. Plus, those who rented land could try to buy the homes they lived in when they went up for sale. It was a tough break, but at least they had some options. So, get this. Back in the day, the bigwigs, like the Secretary of War, decided that if you wanted to buy some land, you had to pay cash. No funny business, just cold, hard cash. The folks running Freedmen's Village knew this was a tall order for the residents, so they tried to help out a little. They told the freedmen, okay, we'll give you more time to get the money together, but then they yanked back their earlier offer that let renters have a 3-month grace period. Instead, everyone had to keep paying rent until October, when the big sale was going down. Now, if you weren't renting land, but were just living in a house, the news was even tougher. You got 10 days, just 10 days to pack up and move out, or else you could kiss all your stuff goodbye. If you didn't leave, the house was getting torn down, burned, or hauled off. Talk about a tough ultimatum. This whole deal showed just how shaky things were for the freedmen in the village. They were hanging on, but just barely. They had to scramble to figure out where they'd live and how they'd survive, all while trying to come up with the cash to buy the homes they'd been living in for years. But these folks weren't just going to roll over and give up. On July 19, 1868, they decided to make a big move. They wrote up a petition and sent it to the United States Senate and the House of Representatives. They asked for a bill that would let them buy 100 acres of land at Arlington and the homes in Freedmen's Village for $10,000. This wasn't just about buying property. It was about claiming their right to a piece of land, to a home, and to a future that they could control. These residents wanted to put down roots, for real this time. They weren't just looking for a handout. They were ready to pay a fair price for the land and homes they'd worked so hard to build their lives around. This wasn't just about having a roof over their heads. It was about creating something permanent, something they could pass down to their kids and grandkids. It was their way of saying, we're here to stay, and we're going to make this place our own. Chapter 8. Battling for Justice, the Legal Struggles of Freedmen. Okay, so picture this. Back in the day, freedmen, formerly enslaved people, were trying to navigate life after gaining their freedom. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. They were dealing with some pretty tough stuff, especially when it came to the law. You see, the law wasn't exactly on their side, and a lot of former slave owners were still trying to keep them down. So the Freedmen's Bureau stepped in to help out. The Bureau had people working all over the place, including a superintendent, a surgeon, and even a matron for the old women's home. During the winter, things got so tough that the superintendent had to stretch his responsibilities to cover a bigger area, making sure everyone got the help they needed. One of the big shots in charge was this guy, J.V.W. Vandenberg. He was a volunteer during the Civil War and ran things until the asylum was shut down on August 31st, 1868. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The Freedmen's Bureau wasn't just about giving out food and clothes. They were like real-life superheroes, swooping in to help freedmen with all sorts of legal stuff. They even hired a lawyer, George B. Vashon, who was a freedman himself. Vashon helped out with over 38 cases, mostly dealing with people who were getting the short end of the stick because they didn't know how the law worked or couldn't afford a lawyer. The thing is, a lot of freedmen were getting treated pretty badly, robbed, attacked, or even worse, and most of the time, they didn't report it because they were scared of what might happen next. And to make things worse, in some places, black folks weren't even allowed to testify in court against white people. Yeah, talk about unfair. So the Freedmen's Bureau had to step in and try to level the playing field. The Bureau was like a safety net, helping out with everything from legal advice to writing letters, and even visiting freedmen who were stuck in jail with no one to help them. They had to represent a ton of people, especially in places like Maryland, Virginia, and Washington, where the legal system wasn't exactly friendly to freedmen. The bottom line? The Bureau was fighting an uphill battle, trying to get justice for people who had been treated unfairly for way too long. But it wasn't easy, and they had to deal with a lot of resistance from folks who still saw freedmen as property rather than people. Even though the Bureau was doing everything they could, they knew that something had to change. Big time, to make sure freedmen were treated equally under the law. Okay, kids, imagine you're playing a game where the rules are totally unfair. Like, so unfair that no matter what you do, you're always going to lose. That's what life was like for a lot of freedmen back in the day. They were finally free from slavery, but they still had to deal with a bunch of messed up laws and people who didn't want to treat them fairly. And so there was this place called Upper Marlboro in Maryland, where the local jail was packed with people, 30 of them to be exact, and 26 were freedmen. Most of these folks weren't even guilty of anything serious. They just got thrown in jail for small stuff or for no real reason at all. And here's the kicker. They couldn't get out because they didn't have the money to pay bail or fines. So they were stuck there, missing out on work during harvest time, which is when they could have made some decent money. By the time they got out, it was too late. They had no cash, no food, and nothing to keep them going through the winter. Now, enter our hero, Special Agent A.K. Brown. This guy was sent to court to help these freedmen get a fair shot. But there was a problem. Brown couldn't be everywhere at once, and without enough money to hire more lawyers, a lot of these freedmen didn't have much of a chance. The truth is, even with some black lawyers around, it was nearly impossible to get justice because public opinion was still against them. And don't even get me started on how unfair the courts were. Black folks couldn't even testify against white people. And if they did, no one took it seriously. But Brown and the Bureau weren't giving up. They did their best to educate freedmen about their rights and how to protect themselves from getting thrown in jail for no reason. The Bureau even helped out when kids were being snatched up and forced into apprenticeships without their parents' consent. Some of these kids had contracts that lasted until they were adults, and if they ran away, they got sent right back like they were property. Now, the whole legal system was a mess. It was super hard to get any justice for the freedmen because the laws were stacked against them. Even when judges and lawmakers wanted to be fair, the juries were full of people who didn't want to see a white person get in trouble for hurting a black person. It was basically a no-win situation. So what did the Bureau do? They tried their best to get justice for the freedmen, but it was an uphill battle. Sometimes they won, but a lot of times they didn't. The sad truth was that, even though the Bureau worked hard to help freed slaves, the deep-rooted prejudice in the South made it nearly impossible for them to get the fair treatment they deserved. Okay, picture this. A long time ago, the freedmen, that's the formerly enslaved folks, were trying to live their new lives in the South, but the laws and courts were stacked against them. It was like playing a game where the rules were totally unfair and the refs, that's the courts, always sided with the other team. Not cool, right? So, to fix this, the government set up these special bureau courts. Think of them like pop-up courts with military judges who stepped in to handle the small stuff, like disputes between the freedmen and the people who used to own them. These courts were there to make sure everyone played fair, at least for the little things. But here's the thing. Sometimes the decisions from these bureau courts didn't stick. The folks who were supposed to enforce the punishments either faced a lot of pushback from the locals or just couldn't track down the troublemakers. Still, these courts managed to bring some level of justice to the freedmen, which was a big deal back then. If the local courts were being unfair, like if they refused to let black people testify or didn't give them a fair shake, then the bureau courts would step in and take over. But if the civil courts started acting right, then the bureau courts would back off and let the regular courts handle things. This wasn't just about fixing the problems right then. It was also about pushing for long-term changes. The idea was to get the regular courts to adopt fairer practices so they wouldn't need the bureau courts anymore. And guess what? It started to work. In places like South Carolina and Alabama, they changed the laws to be more fair to the freedmen, thanks to the pressure from the bureau courts. But here's the twist. While all this legal stuff was going on, another battle was brewing. The freedmen were building their own communities, like Freedmen's Village, and they were doing pretty well. But not everyone was happy about that. White politicians and developers, looking at these growing black communities, started to see them as a problem. They wanted the land and viewed these areas as shanty towns, which wasn't true, but it made it easier to push out the freedmen. This was the start of a pattern. Over time, more black communities across the country faced similar challenges. White flight, redlining, and urban renewal all worked together to push black residents out of their homes and businesses. White flight was when white people moved to the suburbs to get away from what they saw as city problems. Redlining was when banks refused to give loans to people in black neighborhoods, making it hard for them to buy or fix up their homes. In urban renewal, that's when the government came in, knocked down buildings, and pushed people out in the name of redevelopment. Freedmen's Village was a perfect example of how Black communities could thrive despite all these obstacles. The residents there built a self-sufficient community from the ground up, showing just how strong and resilient they were. Sure, there were problems, but overall it was a success story, one that should have been a model for other communities in Arlington. So there you have it, a tale of courts, communities, and a whole lot of perseverance. The Freedmen faced a ton of challenges, but they kept pushing forward, showing everyone what true resilience looks like. So, after the Civil War, African Americans in Arlington had a tough time adjusting to their new lives. Sure, they were free, but that didn't mean life suddenly got easy. One of the biggest problems was finding work. Some freedmen stayed on farms or plantations, but others had to move to cities to find jobs, which sometimes meant leaving their families behind. That was a really hard choice, especially since everyone was trying to stay together after everything they'd been through. Now, even when they found work, it wasn't always great. Women had to take on tough jobs, the kind of work men usually did, just to make sure their families had enough to eat. And let's not forget the Jim Crow laws that made everything even harder by restricting their rights, like voting, owning property, and even just living their lives freely. But here's the thing. Despite all this, a lot of freedmen managed to find jobs and take care of their families. Why? Because many of them had learned skills while they were enslaved. They knew how to do important work like carpentry, blacksmithing, and masonry, and those skills helped them find jobs, especially in the cities. The fight over Freedmen's Village. Then there was the Freedmen's Village, a place that was supposed to be a safe haven for these newly freed people. But not everyone was happy about that. Outsiders wanted the land the village was on, and they didn't care that it was home to people who had just started building new lives. The government tried to shut down the village a few times, but the people living there were organized and the village was well built, so it kept going for a while. Bailey Wyatt's plea. Now, let's talk about Bailey Wyatt. In December 1866, this guy stood up in a big meeting and made a speech that really hit home for a lot of people. He was talking about how the government wanted to close down the contraband camps. Those were temporary shelters for freed slaves, and send people back to the places they'd come from. Wyatt was like, whoa, hold up, that's a terrible idea. He said if they got sent back, especially with all the craziness still happening in the country, they'd just end up in the same old terrible situations they'd fought so hard to escape. He didn't just talk about the future. He reminded everyone about the past, too. He talked about how enslaved people were treated like nothing, even being stripped of their names, which is a huge deal. Imagine not even being able to keep your own name. He shared his own story about how, after working all week, he'd walk miles just to see his wife, only to find out she'd been sold away. That kind of loss was something they'd all experienced, and it made them ask, how long do we have to suffer like this? Wyatt's speech was a wake-up call. He was saying, we've come too far and been through too much to let things slide back to the way they were. He wanted everyone to remember the pain of the past so they could fight to keep their freedom and make sure it really meant something. Wyatt's perspective on freedom. So this guy, Bailey Wyatt, looked around at the situation after the Civil War and thought, hey, this freedom we've got isn't just because of people. It's thanks to the big guy upstairs, God. He believed it was God's will that they were now free, and he was really grateful for it. But he also knew that they didn't get here alone. Folks from the North, especially the Quakers, had put in a lot of work and even risked their lives to help the freedmen. Wyatt gave them a big shout out, saying they were the freedmen's best friends on earth. The tough reality. Even though Wyatt was thankful, he wasn't wearing rose-colored glasses. He knew that going back to the counties where they used to live wasn't going to be a walk in the park. In fact, it could be downright dangerous. The white folks there saw the freedmen as traitors because they had ditched the Confederacy to support the Union. Wyatt warned everyone that this resentment was still strong and they needed to be careful. Staying strong and seeking support, the freedmen, now living among people who used to be their oppressors, felt pretty vulnerable. They were in a place where they weren't exactly welcomed with open arms. But despite all the negativity, they still had hope that their friends in the North would keep supporting them. Wyatt made a passionate appeal to these Northern allies, saying that the freedmen's very lives depended on their continued help. His speech really struck a chord with everyone, and people like Mr. Vining were determined to spread Wyatt's message far and wide, claiming their rightful land. Wyatt didn't stop there. He argued that the land the freedmen were living on rightfully belonged to them, not just because they had worked it, but because they had paid for it in a way. with their blood, sweat, and tears. He reminded everyone that during the war, the Union had promised the freedmen land in exchange for their loyalty. They were told that if they supported the Union and left the Confederacy, they'd get land and protection. The freedmen had given up everything they had, money, homes, cattle, because they trusted the Union's promise of freedom and a better life. The broken promises. But now, it looked like those promises weren't being kept. Wyatt voiced the deep disappointment and betrayal the freedmen felt. They had believed the Union was made up of honorable men who would stick to their word. But when they were told to leave the land they'd been promised, it shook their faith in everything they'd been told. Wyatt's speech was a call for the North to step up, keep their promises, and support the freedmen in their fight for true freedom and equality. The big letdown. So, picture this. The freedmen, who were promised freedom and a chance to build new lives, did everything they were told. They even paid rent on the land they were living on, thinking, hey, this will make sure we can stay here. But then, boom, the Union, who had been all buddy-buddy before, suddenly told them, sorry, but you gotta pack up and leave. This land actually belongs to the people who used to own you. Yeah, talk about a major bummer. Wyatt's big speech. This guy, Bailey Wyatt, wasn't having any of it. He got up in front of a crowd and laid it all out. He talked about how unfair it was that the freedmen were being kicked off land they had paid for and worked hard to improve. He even mentioned some fancy order from General Sherman that said the freedmen were supposed to get paid for their work on the land. But, surprise, surprise, that wasn't happening. The freedmen were stuck in a lousy situation with the Union backing out on their promises and leaving them to fend for themselves. Where are we supposed to go? Wyatt then dropped the big question. Where are we supposed to go? The freedmen had built homes, started to rebuild their lives, and now they were being told to just up and leave. But where to? The woods, the streets, by the river? There was nowhere safe or stable for them to go, and Wyatt made it clear. He wasn't asking for charity. He was proud of what he'd accomplished on his own, but he knew that most folks weren't so lucky. No more empty promises. Wyatt was pretty mad about all the broken promises. The Union had promised freedom, land, and a fresh start, but now they were saying, oops, never mind. Give it all back to your old masters. Wyatt wasn't buying it. He called out the Union, saying they'd let the freedmen down big time, and he wasn't going to let them forget it. He told the freedmen that they had to stick together and trust in God because the government sure wasn't going to help them out anymore. A call for justice. In his speech, Wyatt made it clear. This wasn't just about land, it was about justice. The freedmen had worked hard, followed the rules, and were still getting kicked around. Wyatt wanted the Union to live up to its promises and give the freedmen the fair chance they deserve. He wasn't asking for handouts, just for the government to do what it said it would do. The reality check. Wyatt's speech was also a big reality check. He talked about how tough things were for the freedmen, even after they'd been freed. They were still living in crappy conditions, struggling to survive. But Wyatt kept the faith, believing that if they stuck together and did the right thing, God would see them through. Freedmen's Village, the ups and downs. Freedmen's Village was supposed to be a model community where the freedmen could build better lives, and in some ways it was. The place was laid out like a small town, and some folks were finding jobs. But it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The village was isolated, the people were poor, and it was hard to get ahead. Still, it was a step in the right direction, a place where the freedmen could start to rebuild, even with all the challenges they faced. Chapter 8. The Last Stand, Closing the Village. So, here's the deal. In 1867, this newspaper, the Staunton Vindicator, decided to unload all their anger on Freedmen's Village. They basically said, these folks are poor, miserable, and wearing rags, like they were trying to make them sound like they were completely hopeless. According to the newspaper, the whole idea of Freedmen's Village was a big mistake, and they acted like supporting the village was a huge waste of time and money. They even went so far as to say that the freedmen would never be able to take care of themselves and were just a burden on society. And it wasn't just this one newspaper. Lots of folks were echoing the same nonsense. Some people even thought the best solution was to shut down the village and ship everyone back to Africa. Yeah, like that's gonna solve anything. These people weren't just trying to shut down the village, they were basically trying to erase all the progress the freedmen had made. But despite all this hate, the people in Freedmen's Village didn't give up. The village itself was proof that these folks were determined to build new lives, no matter how much others wanted to see them fail. It wasn't just about having a place to live, it was about standing up and saying, we belong here too. More newspapers stirring the pot. Then in 1886, the Alexandria Gazette decided to join in the fun, spreading fear and anger by claiming that Freedmen's Village was the reason taxes were so high in Arlington. They tried to paint the village as a drain on everyone else, saying the residents didn't pay their fair share of taxes. It was all about making the village look like a problem that needed to be dealt with, like the residents were somehow freeloaders dragging everyone else down. But here's the thing. The people who wanted to get rid of Freedmen's Village were actually scared. They were scared of losing control and power. They saw the Freedmen building a community and getting their lives together, and that made them nervous. So they used these scare tactics to try to justify shutting down the village. At the end of the day, Freedmen's Village was caught in the middle of a big argument. Some people saw it as a necessary part of helping former slaves adjust to freedom, while others saw it as a waste of money that didn't benefit them directly. The village became this big symbol, either of hope and progress or of something people wanted to get rid of, depending on who you asked. So, picture this. It's the late 1800s and people are super mad about Freedmen's Village. Why? Because some folks feel like the government's been spending too much time and money helping the freedmen, former slaves, get back on their feet. These people think that the village is just a waste of space, and they start grumbling that all this land could be put to better use, like making money, which they think is way more important. But here's the twist. Freedmen's Village isn't just a place. It's like a symbol of everything people were arguing about after the Civil War. On one side, you've got people who see the village as a sign of hope, a place where freed slaves can finally start living free lives. On the other side, you've got people who want things to go back to how they were before, and they see the village as a reminder that they lost the war, and they're not happy about it. The push to shut it down. Fast forward to July 1891, and the newspapers are really pushing the idea that the village needs to go. They're saying, hey, if the government doesn't want this land, why not sell it off? It could make some good money. They argue that the people in the village aren't really using the land in a way that makes any money, so why let them keep it? Meanwhile, the people living in Freedmen's Village are fighting tooth and nail to stay there. They've been hit with all sorts of bad press and nasty rumors, but they just keep building their community, improving their homes, and trying to make a decent life. They even start buying their homes from the government to secure their place. Then, in January 1889, the legal stuff really kicks off. A guy named James E. Clement, who's a big shot attorney, tells the Secretary of War that the courts have basically thrown up their hands and said, we're out, when it comes to dealing with the village, because the land belongs to the U.S. government now. Clement warns that without proper law enforcement, the village could turn into a big mess, full of crime and disorder. But here's the thing. All this talk about the village being a problem, it's not just about law and order or making money. It's about deep-seated fears and prejudices. The people pushing to shut down the village are really just trying to erase the progress the freedmen have made. They don't want to see these formerly enslaved people succeed because it challenges everything they believe about who should have power and control. Despite all this pressure, the residents of Freedmen's Village don't give up. They keep building, keep improving their land, and keep fighting for their right to stay. But the pressure is mounting, especially from the War Department, which wants the land back to expand Fort Myer. By the time we hit the 1890s, the village is starting to break apart. Some people move away, thanks to new streetcar lines that connect Arlington to other towns, while others stay and keep the fight going. Eventually, the village can't hold out forever. The government's efforts to reclaim the land and the ongoing pressure from outside forces take their toll. By the end of the 19th century, the village is starting to fade, but the spirit of the people who live there, that never dies. They spread out across Arlington, taking with them the sense of community and resilience they built in Freedmen's Village. So, after the Civil War, a bunch of freed slaves set up shop in this place called Freedmen's Village in Arlington. At first, the government helped out, making it a decent place to live. The War Department even helped design the whole thing, like a big suburban neighborhood where everyone could start fresh. But here's the kicker. As time went on, the government started to back off, and some folks weren't too happy that this village was still standing. The big bad eviction. By the late 1880s, people were like, hey, this land could be worth a lot of money. Why are we letting these folks stay here when we could sell it off and make a fortune? So they started pushing to close down the village. In December 1887, eviction orders went out, basically telling the residents, you've got 90 days to pack up and get out. Oh, and by the way, you're not getting paid for your homes. Ouch, right? But the residents weren't just going to roll over and leave. They got organized and fought back. John B. Syphax, one of the leaders, even suggested, "Hey, if you're going to kick us out, at least pay us for our homes." He was asking for $350 per household, but the government came back with way less. Some folks got a little money, like the Owens family, who got $130, but others got zip. In the end, they got a bit more from Congress, about $576 per household, but it was still way less than what they deserved. By 1900, the village was gone, but the people who lived there didn't just disappear. They spread out across Arlington, taking that strong community spirit with them. They'd built something special, and even though the village was closed, that sense of resilience and determination lived on. The African American community in Arlington kept growing, building new homes, churches, and businesses, and pretty much showing everyone that they weren't going anywhere. As the years rolled on, Arlington started to change, with more folks moving in and building new communities. African Americans began to embrace this suburban life, just like everyone else. They created new neighborhoods, like Green Valley, where they could live, work, and worship together. It wasn't easy, though. They faced a lot of challenges, like segregation and discrimination, but they kept pushing forward. Even after the village was gone, the legacy of what they built there kept going. The residents of Arlington's new African American communities had to be self-reliant, but that only made them stronger. They became business owners, leaders, and trailblazers in their own right, proving that they could thrive no matter what was thrown at them. So, yeah, the government might have shut down Freedmen's Village, but that wasn't the end of the story. The people who lived there left a mark on Arlington that couldn't be erased. They turned a tough situation into a story of success, resilience, and community spirit that's still remembered today. And that, my friends, is how the people of Freedmen's Village turned a forced eviction into a lasting legacy. So, picture this. It's the late 1800s, and the folks from Freedmen's Village, who had worked super hard to build a community after the Civil War, suddenly found themselves being told to pack up and leave. The government and developers wanted the land for other stuff, probably because it was worth a lot of money. But the people of the village weren't just going to disappear quietly. They had spent years building homes, churches, and social clubs, and they weren't about to let all that go without a fight. When the village was finally closed down in 1889 and the last families left by 1900, these determined folks didn't just give up. Nope, they took the spirit of the village with them and spread it across Arlington. They moved into new neighborhoods like Green Valley and Halls Hill where they could continue building their lives. These new communities, even though they looked different, more rural and spread out, still had that same vibe of resilience and self-sufficiency that the village had. As these former villagers settled into different parts of Arlington, they brought with them all the lessons they'd learned from living in Freedmen's Village. They knew how to build strong communities, so that's exactly what they did. They started new neighborhoods that were all about working together, helping each other out, and making the most of the land they had. These neighborhoods might have been smaller or more packed together, but they were just as strong in spirit. But of course, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. The white folks in Arlington weren't too happy about these thriving black communities. They started making all sorts of rules to try and push African Americans out. Things like zoning laws and planning regulations that made it hard for black people to keep their homes. It was like they wanted to erase everything the Freedmen had built, just like they did with the village. But here's the thing. The African American communities in Arlington didn't just roll over. They pushed back by creating their own neighborhoods and making sure they had a place to live, work, and worship. They built their own suburbs, even when the odds were stacked against them. These weren't just homes, they were symbols of their determination to stand strong and not let anyone take away what they had worked so hard to achieve. The story of Freedmen's Village didn't end when the village itself was closed. The people who lived there took that spirit of resilience with them and spread it all across Arlington. They faced down laws and rules that were designed to push them out, and they kept on building. They made sure their communities were places where they could thrive, even in the face of all the challenges thrown at them. And that's how the legacy of Freedmen's Village lived on, not just in the buildings, but in the hearts and minds of the people who refused to give up. So, imagine this. Arlington's African American neighborhoods were like little fortresses of hope and community. Even though some people in power wanted to kick them out and make the whole place an all-white neighborhood, the folks living there weren't going to just pack up and leave without a fight. They kept building their homes, churches, and community centers, places that weren't just buildings, but were like the glue holding everyone together. These neighborhoods were more than just a bunch of houses on the street. They were where people felt safe, connected, and proud of who they were. Even though there were a lot of rules and pressures trying to push them out, the African American community in Arlington kept growing. It was like they were saying, "We're here, we're strong, and we're not going anywhere." No matter how hard things got, these communities kept fighting to stay in the places they called home. From the first time someone tried to evict them in 1868, they managed to delay it and hold on for as long as they could. It was tough, but their ability to stick together and fight for what was right helped them survive in a world that wasn't always fair to them. The village of Arlington wasn't just any neighborhood. It was a special place full of people who had once been enslaved, but were now building a new life. Whether they bought their land or rented it, they made it their own, creating a community that was alive and full of energy. Even though there were efforts to push them out, the legacy of these neighborhoods is a big part of what makes Arlington what it is today. But then came the eviction orders, kind of like a bad dream that you can't wake up from. The government told these families they had just 90 days to leave, with no money or anything to help them start over. It was a harsh reminder that sometimes the very people who should be supporting you can let you down. Even though the eviction didn't go the way they wanted, the way these people stood their ground is pretty amazing. They didn't just roll over. They fought hard to stay in the homes and neighborhoods they had built with their own hands. Even though they were eventually forced out, their story isn't just one of loss. It's about never giving up, no matter how tough things get. Conclusion. Imagine you've just been through a really tough time. Like, really tough. You finally got your freedom, but now you're trying to figure out what comes next. That's where Freedmen's Village comes in. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a random place where people ended up. It was a spot where newly freed African Americans could start to rebuild their lives. The government set it up, but it wasn't just about the rules and plans they laid out. Nope, the real magic happened because of the people who lived there. These folks were determined to turn this village into more than just a temporary camp. They wanted it to be a real community. Sure, the Freedmen's Bureau helped by providing some basics like housing, jobs, and schools. But the real power of the village came from the residents themselves. They weren't just sitting around waiting for someone to tell them what to do. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work, creating schools, churches, and other community spaces that became the heart of the village. Now, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were plenty of rules and restrictions, and sometimes it felt like the government was more interested in control than in helping people. But even with those challenges, the residents pushed back and made decisions for themselves. They were building something special, something that would last. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a place to crash for a while. It was a blueprint for what African American communities could look like. The people there were setting an example of how to create a thriving, self-sufficient community, even in the face of adversity. They showed that, given the chance, they could build something lasting and meaningful. Even after the village officially closed, the ideas and values that grew there didn't just disappear. Former residents took what they'd learned and spread it to new communities in Arlington and beyond. They kept building, kept striving, and laid down roots that would grow for generations. Freedmen's Village was a place of hope, but it was also a place of hard work. The people there didn't just sit back and wait for things to happen. They made them happen. Whether they were growing food, building homes, or creating social networks, they were constantly working towards a better future. The village might be gone now, but its impact is still felt today. It's a reminder that with determination, resilience, and a little bit of grit, people can build something amazing, even when the odds are stacked against them. Freedmen's Village, building a community against the odds. So, picture this. You finally got your freedom, and now you're in a place called Freedmen's Village, where you can start over and build a new life. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, but the people there made the best of what they had. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a bunch of random houses thrown together. It was a real community with 50 wooden houses, each one built to hold 4 families. Sure, they had to share a chimney, but everyone had their own space, which was a big deal back then. The village also had schools, a hospital, a tailor shop, a carpenter's workshop, and even a place called Providence House, where elderly and disabled folks could live. It was like a mini town where people could support themselves and live with dignity. But let's be real. Life in Freedmen's Village wasn't a walk in the park. The streets were rough, with tree stumps everywhere, and the houses were packed pretty close together. There wasn't much room for gardens, and getting around wasn't exactly easy. Plus, everyone had to work hard. Men were expected to work 10 hours a day on farms or in workshops, earning about $10 a month, while women and even kids had jobs to do too. The village ran like a tight ship. There were rules for everything, from work schedules to keeping track of what everyone earned and spent. If you wanted to leave the village to work elsewhere, you had to sign a contract for a year or more, and if you left, you couldn't come back unless you had a really good reason. The living conditions were tough. People were crammed into small spaces with broken stoves that filled their homes with soot. There was no running water, so everyone had to use chamber pots and shared outhouses. And don't even get started on the lice and bed bugs. It wasn't glamorous, but it was what they had. And they made it work. Despite all the challenges, Freedmen's Village was more than just a place to live. It was a symbol of what people could achieve when they worked together. They built a community from scratch, creating schools, workshops, and support systems that helped them survive and even thrive. Freedmen's Village showed that even in the toughest conditions, people could come together to build something meaningful. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step forward, proving that with determination and hard work, a community could rise from the ashes of the past and pave the way for a better future. And there you have it. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a place, it was a testament to the strength and resilience of its residents, who built a community that laid the groundwork for the future, even in the face of serious challenges. So, imagine you've just been freed from slavery and you're trying to figure out what comes next. Freedmen's Village was supposed to be a fresh start, a place where newly freed people could live, work, and begin building new lives. But like most things in life, it wasn't perfect. A place to call home, but not without struggles. Freedmen's Village offered people a place to live and the chance to work and learn, which was a big deal back then, but there were some serious downsides too. The rules were super strict, like you couldn't even leave the village without permission, and if you didn't work as hard as the officials wanted, you could lose basic things like food and clothes. The pay wasn't great either, and people were often left hanging, waiting for their money to come through. Life in the village wasn't easy. The houses were crowded and conditions could be pretty rough. Some folks had to deal with bed bugs and lice, and there wasn't much in the way of running water or bathrooms. Plus, there were reports of abuse, which made life even harder for the people trying to get by. Despite all the problems, Freedmen's Village was an important step for African Americans. It gave them a place to start over, even if the system wasn't exactly fair. People were able to live together, learn together, and support each other, which was huge after everything they'd been through. Understandably, some people weren't thrilled with how things were run in the village. They spoke out about the bad conditions and unfair treatment, but that often led to them getting kicked out. However, there were also residents who managed to live pretty comfortably, with enough food and decent housing. The village's school was also a bright spot, giving kids the chance to learn to read and write, something they didn't have before. Freedmen's Village was a place full of contradictions. On one hand, it was a safe space where people could start over. On the other, it was still controlled by a system that wasn't fully ready to let go of old ways. Even after the Civil War, there was a lot of tension between the promise of freedom and the reality of what that freedom actually looked like. After the Civil War, everything changed. Suddenly, people who had been enslaved were free, and the whole country had to figure out what that meant. For African Americans, this was a time of huge change, but it was also confusing and hard. For white Southerners, accepting this new reality was tough, and many resisted the idea of true equality. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up to help with this transition. It provided food, housing, and jobs, and even helped people find land. But not everyone was happy about this, especially white Southerners who felt like their way of life was being turned upside down. The Bureau did its best, but it was often short on money and resources, so it couldn't always help as much as it wanted to. Still, it made a big difference, especially by helping set up churches and schools that would become the heart of African American communities for years to come. In 1867, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which basically hit the reset button on the South after the Civil War. The South was divided into 5 military districts, and each state had to play by some new rules if they wanted back into the Union. These rules included accepting the 14th Amendment, which made everyone born in the U.S. a citizen, and giving African American men the right to vote. If a state didn't follow these rules, it was left out of the Union, kind of like being grounded until they agreed to the terms. Reconstruction was a roller coaster. There were lots of changes, and not everyone was happy about it. Some white Southerners were super mad and even violent about the whole thing. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan popped up, trying to scare African Americans and their supporters into giving up their new rights. In response, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act in 1871, making it illegal to mess with people's civil rights. Despite all the drama, Reconstruction did make some serious strides, especially in giving African Americans more political and social rights. For the Freedmen, education was the golden ticket to a better life. Schools in places like Freedmen's Village focused on teaching practical skills, things like trades and crafts that would help people stand on their own 2 feet. By learning these skills, the freedmen could transition from a life of slavery to one where they had control over their own lives and could enjoy the rights that had been denied to them for so long. Reconstruction wasn't just about politics, it was also about building strong communities. African Americans started churches, schools, and businesses that became the backbone of their communities. These places gave them the tools they needed to navigate life as free citizens and helped them build a sense of identity and purpose. Even after being freed, the freedmen were starting from scratch, often as the poorest and most marginalized group in the country. They had endured years of brutal slavery and now faced the challenge of building new lives in a society that wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. They called on the government to help dismantle the systems that had kept them down for so long, and they demanded the rights and opportunities that had been denied to them. Freedom came with its own set of challenges. The freedmen had to figure out how to make a living, become literate, and navigate the new world of free labor. But it wasn't just about surviving. It was also about thriving, forming stable families, building homes, and educating their children. Freedmen's Village was one place where these goals started to take shape, turning from a temporary shelter into a thriving community that served as a model for others. The federal government tried different ways to help African Americans settle into their new lives, often focusing on giving them land to farm. In Arlington, Virginia, land that once belonged to Confederate General Robert E. Lee was turned into Freedmen's Village, where new ideas about community and land use were put to the test. But the transition was rough. Many freedmen struggled with starvation and exposure because they were unfamiliar with how to survive in a free labor market. Life in Freedmen's Village wasn't easy. Residents had to pay rent, and if they couldn't, they risked being kicked out. When winter hit, these eviction policies caused a lot of unrest. The residents pushed back, listing their grievances, like not getting enough food or having no heat in their homes. After an investigation, some changes were made, but the struggle for fair treatment was a constant battle. In 1868, the Freedmen's Bureau began winding down Freedmen's Village, but residents were given a couple of years to buy their homes or lease nearby land. This gave them a chance to start on the path to owning land and gaining economic independence. The Bureau also relocated some of the village's most vulnerable residents to a hospital near Howard University, showing that even as the village was being dismantled, efforts were made to take care of those who needed it most. After the Civil War, the residents of Freedmen's Village turned it into a place where they could live on their own terms. They grew vegetables to eat and sell in nearby Washington, making some money and standing on their own feet. Some people got jobs with the government. Others worked in brickyards, laundromats, or did sewing. This wasn't just about making ends meet. It showed how strong and resourceful they were in making a new life after slavery. But then trouble loomed. In 1882, things took a bad turn when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that George Washington Custis Lee, whose family once owned the land, should get compensated for it. The government, eager to take back the land, started pushing to shut down the village. By 1886, the War Department was telling everyone to pack up and leave. This forced removal wasn't just about losing a place to live, it was the end of a powerful chapter in African American history. Freedmen's Village had been a real-life experiment in what freedom could look like, offering people a chance to build something for themselves. Even though the village was eventually torn down, the legacy of its residents lived on. Their determination to create a stable, self-sufficient community showed the world what they could achieve, even when the odds were stacked against them. The land where Freedmen's Village stood became hot property. Local leaders were itching to turn it into a park, build a memorial bridge, and extend the main road. They were all for kicking out the residents to make this happen. Even state and county officials got in on the action, trying to take away the residents' voting rights and accusing them of everything from draining public resources to illegal tree cutting. It was clear. They wanted the village gone. By the late 1880s, the people living in Freedmen's Village knew their time was running out. They tried to fight back. One person even asked for $350 for each family forced to leave, but that didn't work out. Eventually, In 1900, the government demolished the village. The buildings were gone, but the spirit of the community wasn't. Most of the people who were forced out of the village ended up settling in nearby areas, helping to grow and shape those communities. Today, many families in Northern Virginia can trace their roots back to Freedmen's Village, and while the government gave back a little money, $75,000 for a contraband tax, it was a small win in a much bigger story of loss and resilience. When Freedmen's Village was shut down, many of its institutions, like churches, schools, and social groups, relocated across Arlington. This helped spread the village's culture and influence throughout the area. New black communities like Green Valley, Halls Hill, and Johnson's Hill emerged or grew stronger as a result. These neighborhoods carried forward the village's legacy, building on the strength and resilience of its residents. By the late 1800s, a small but strong black community had firmly taken root in Arlington. The connections and institutions that started in Freedmen's Village helped these communities survive and thrive, even in the face of ongoing challenges. Freedmen's Village was the largest African American community in Arlington after the Civil War and played a huge role in the area's history. Although the village was eventually taken down, its legacy lived on in the people and the institutions they created. Today, families in Arlington still feel the impact of Freedmen's Village, a reminder of the resilience and determination that helped shape the community's future. After the Civil War, African Americans faced huge challenges as they tried to adjust to life as free citizens. Even though they were no longer enslaved, the system wasn't set up to support them. They didn't have much help figuring out how to survive in a society that still didn't really see them as equals. But despite all of that, they didn't give up. They took charge of their lives and built communities that showed their strength and determination. Freedmen's Village was a perfect example of this. Freedmen's Village wasn't just a temporary place for formerly enslaved people to stay. It was a thriving community where they could live, work, and grow. While other camps in the South were shut down, often before the Civil War even ended, Freedmen's Village kept going strong. It had more resources and support than most, and the people there were able to create schools, workshops, and businesses that helped them build a stable life. From 1863 to 1900, Freedmen's Village became a place where African Americans could break away from the old ways of plantation life. They showed that with the right tools, like education, land to work on, and strong community ties, they could create a successful and self-sufficient community. This wasn't just a place to survive, it was a place where people could thrive and build a future for themselves and their families. But it wasn't always easy. The land Freedmen's Village was built on was once owned by the family of Confederate General Robert E. Lee. After the Civil War, his family fought to get it back, and by 1886, the government decided to clear out the village. The residents tried to fight back and even asked for compensation, but in the end, they were forced to leave. Even though Freedmen's Village was eventually shut down, its legacy didn't end there. The people who lived there spread out to other areas in Northern Virginia, Maryland, and Washington, D.C. And they brought with them the spirit of resilience and community they had built in the village. Many went on to help establish Shaw, Washington, D.C.'s first African-American neighborhood. Today, Freedmen's Village is remembered as a powerful example of what African Americans can achieve, even when the odds are against them. The descendants of the people who live there are still in Arlington, and their history is an important part of the community's story. Freedmen's Village stands as a symbol of strength, determination, and the ongoing fight for justice and equality. By looking back at the history of Freedmen's Village, we can learn a lot about the importance of resilience and the power of community. It reminds us that even when faced with challenges, people can come together to create something strong and lasting. The story of Freedmen's Village isn't just about the past. It's about inspiring future generations to keep pushing for a better, more equal world. The Freedmen's Village is a story of people taking control of their futures, building something amazing despite all the obstacles, and leaving behind a legacy that still matters today. It's a powerful reminder of what can happen when a community comes together with determination and a vision for a better life. Hey there, reader. First off, a big, sloppy thank you for cracking open this book and sticking with it. Seriously, it's awesome that you took the time to dive into the stories and history packed into these pages. My biggest hope is that something in here made you think, maybe even fired you up a bit and helped you get a better grip on the amazing history of the Freedmen's Village. Now here's the deal. This book is not just some dusty old collection of words. Nope, it's part of something way bigger. I want you to own it, make it your own, and help me spread the word. If you've got a sec, leaving a review on Amazon would be super cool. It helps other people find these stories, but don't stop there. Pass this book around. Share it with your friends, family, and anyone who loves a good story. Together, we can make sure the history of the Freedmen's Village isn't just some forgotten footnote. And guess what? This isn't the end of the road. I've got more stories coming your way. Yep. Announcement. Hey there, awesome listeners. Get ready because we're about to dive into a 20-question quiz. Yep, that's right. 20 questions that will test your knowledge about the Freedmen's Bureau, Freedmen's Village, education, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, and more. So, buckle up and let's see how much you know. Remember, I'll give you the correct answer after each question, so stay tuned and have fun with it. Question 1. What was the primary purpose of the Freedmen's Bureau after the Civil War? A. To help freedmen adjust to their new lives. B. To enforce Jim Crow laws. C. To rebuild the Confederate Army. D. To create new slave codes. Answer. A. To help freedmen adjust to their new lives. If you chose this answer, you're a genius because you're absolutely right. If you went for any of the others, that was a wonky choice. But hey, nice try. Question 2. Freedmen's Village was established primarily as A. Military base. B. Refugee camp for freed slaves. C. Plantation. D. Factory town. Answer. B. Refugee camp for freed slaves. If you picked this, you're on fire because you nailed it. If you went for something else, that was a wild guess, but props for giving it a shot. Question 3. Which U.S. president signed the Emancipation Proclamation? A. George Washington. B. Thomas Jefferson. C. Abraham Lincoln. D. Ulysses S. Grant. Answer. C. Abraham Lincoln. If you chose Abraham Lincoln, you're basically the MVP of this quiz because you're spot on. Any other choice? Well, that's a swing and a miss, but keep swinging. Question 4. Frederick Douglass was known for his work as A. Slave owner, B. Abolitionist and orator, C. Confederate general, D. Plantation manager. Answer. B. Abolitionist and orator. If you picked this, you're crushing it because that's correct. If you picked something else, that was way off, but keep your head up. Question 5. What did the Emancipation Proclamation do? A. Freed all slaves in the United States. B. Freed slaves in Confederate states. C. Created new laws for slave codes. D. Ended the Civil War. Answer. B. Freed slaves in Confederate states. If you selected this, you're straight up brilliant because you got it right. If you went for another choice, that was a total curveball, but keep going. Question 6. Which group was primarily served by the Freedmen's Bureau? A. Northern factory workers. B. Confederate soldiers. C. Newly freed slaves. D. European immigrants. Answer. C. Newly freed slaves. If you chose this, you're basically a history boss because that's correct. If you chose another, that was a bit off the mark, but way to keep trying. Question 7. Frederick Douglass was once A. President of the United States. B. A slave. C. A plantation owner. D. A Confederate general. Answer. B. A slave. If you selected this, you're winning because you nailed it. If you picked another answer, that was way off the grid, but nice effort. Question 8. The Freedmen's Village was located in A. New York, B. Virginia, C. Georgia, D. Texas. Answer. B. Virginia. If you chose Virginia, you're a rock star because that's correct. If you guessed another state, that was off base, but keep trying. Question 9. The main goal of the schools established by the Freedmen's Bureau was to A. Train soldiers. B. Educate newly freed slaves. C. Teach farming techniques. D. Promote Confederate ideals. Answer. B. Educate newly freed slaves. And if you picked this, you're on a roll because that's right. If you went for something else, that was a little out there, but keep it up. Question 10. What document did Abraham Lincoln issue that declared the freedom of slaves in Confederate states? A. The Gettysburg Address. B. The Bill of Rights. C. The Emancipation Proclamation. D. The 13th Amendment. Answer. C. The Emancipation Proclamation. If you selected this, you're absolutely slaying this quiz because you got it. If you picked another one, that's a no-go, but stay in the game. Question 11. How were children of freedmen often treated under the black codes? A. They were given free education. B. They were apprenticed under harsh conditions. C. They were treated as equals to white children. D. They were elected to political office. Answer B. They were apprenticed under harsh conditions. If you went with this, you're basically a pro because you got it right. If you chose another option, that was a bit off, but don't give up. Question 12. Who was known for his powerful speeches advocating for the rights of African Americans? A. Robert E. Lee. B. Jefferson Davis. C. Frederick Douglass. D. Stonewall Jackson. Answer C. Frederick Douglass. If you picked this, you're unstoppable because that's correct. If you guessed another name, that was not even close, but nice try. Question 13. What was the purpose of the Black Codes? A. To provide equal rights for freedmen. B. To continue the subjugation of freedmen. C. To promote integration. D. To end the Civil War. Answer B. To continue the subjugation of freedmen. If you selected this, you're straight up awesome because you're right. If you chose another answer, that was way off, but keep playing. Question 14. What did the Freedmen's Bureau establish to support education? A. Military academies. B. Public schools for freedmen. C. Secret societies. D. Confederate schools. Answer B. Public schools for freedmen. If you picked this, you're a genius because that's absolutely correct. If you guessed another, that was a bit out there, but keep pushing. Question 15. Which president was assassinated shortly after the end of the Civil War? A. George Washington. B. Thomas Jefferson. C. Abraham Lincoln. D. Ulysses S. Grant. Answer C. Abraham Lincoln. If you chose this, you're crushing it because that's correct. If you picked another president, that was way off, but props for trying. Question 16. The Freedmen's Village was an effort to A. Segregate freedmen from white communities. B. Provide a safe community for freedmen. C. Build a new capital for the Confederacy. D. Establish a Confederate monument. Answer B. Provide a safe community for freedmen. If you picked this, you're on fire because that's right. If you guessed another option, that was a bit of a detour, but keep going strong. Question 17. What did the Emancipation Proclamation fail to do? A. Free slaves in Union states. B. End the Civil War. C. Free slaves in Confederate states. D. Establish voting rights for women. Answer A. Free slaves in Union states. If you chose this, you're a legend because that's correct. If you picked another, that was a little off, but keep up the effort. Question 18. How were freedmen's children often exploited after the Civil War? A. Forced into high-paying jobs. B. Apprenticed into unfair labor. C. Sent to college for free. D. Elected as government officials. Answer B. Apprenticed into unfair labor. If you picked this, you're nailing it because that's absolutely correct. If you guessed something else, that was a wild swing, but nice try. Question 19. Which group was most impacted by the Jim Crow laws? A. Wealthy landowners. B. Immigrants from Europe. C. African Americans. D. Native Americans. Answer C. African Americans. If you picked this, you're on a winning streak because you're right. If you chose another group, that was a bit off, but keep going. Question 20. Frederick Douglass believed strongly in A. Slavery. B. Equality for all. C. Segregation. D. Confederate ideals. Answer B. Equality for all. If you picked this, you're unstoppable because you got it right. If you guessed something else, that was way off, but good effort. Wrap up. Well done. You've just rocked a 20-question quiz, and I hope you had a blast doing it. Whether you aced it or learned something new, remember, you're awesome for giving it a go. Keep up the curiosity, and who knows, maybe you'll be the next history whiz to take the world by storm.
Once again, thank you for joining us today and listening to this audiobook. We truly appreciate your time and support. I'd like to invite you to please like, comment, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. By doing so, you're not just staying connected, you're becoming part of an exclusive community dedicated to celebrating knowledge, culture, and empowerment. If you're interested in the ebook or paperback edition of this audiobook, head over to our Amazon page. You'll find the link in the description below. And for those of you looking to show your support in other ways, we've got custom t-shirts, hoodies, and beautiful African wall art available. Just click the merchandise link in the description to check it out. Thank you and enjoy the audiobook.